video that is associated with that story. And so after I tell each story, you'll actually get to see all or parts of those videos. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their toilet seats with homemade cardboard ones. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. I've just launched a new channel for those kindred spirits who want to dive a little deeper into the unknown. Hit the link below to join me there. Let's keep our late night conversations going in a slightly more intimate space. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of January 3rd, 2013, a 33-year-old man named Vladimir Sherbov stepped off a cable car at a ski resort in Russia. He was standing on the top of a snow-covered mountain, along with his friend Denis Barakov and Denis's wife, whose name was Yekaterina. Vladimir and Denis went to this resort all the time, usually to snowboard. But on this day, they were not here to snowboard. They were here to try out an exciting new ride that all their friends had been talking about recently. It had been Denis's idea to come, but Vladimir had been totally on board until now that he was actually seeing this new ride itself. So the ride was actually set up straight ahead of them at the very top of the beginner's ski slope. Now, where they got off from the cable car, it wasn't literally the very top of the mountain. It was like most of the way up. And when they got off the car, basically there was an additional stretch of mountain going up, not particularly steep, but that stretch from, the cable car to the top of this additional stretch was the beginner's slope. And so from where they're standing, having just gotten off, they'd be looking up, this beginner's slope. And the ride is right there. It's basically on that slope. And Vladimir, who's looking at the slope, he's looking at the ride, he could see the ride operator standing at the top of the slope, basically waiting for customers to go on this ride. But to Vladimir, it was kind of weird because, there wasn't really any signage for this new ride, and there was no line of people, at least that he could see, waiting to get on. And considering all the hype that Vladimir had heard about this ride recently, he'd expected something much bigger and more well advertised, where he could potentially get up here and watch loads of other people do it first before he did it. And so suddenly, Vladimir couldn't help but have just sort of a bad feeling about this. Like, why isn't anyone else doing this ride? Like, what's going on here? And so he turned to his friend, Denis, and he said he had a bad feeling, and he really wasn't sure if he wanted to do this anymore. But Denis was like really excited about this, and he begged Vladimir not to bail on this yet. And, Vladimir could tell that Denis really was very excited. He wanted to try this ride, and he didn't want to do it alone. And so Vladimir was like, all right, fine, let's go do it. And so Vladimir, Denis, and Denis's wife, Yekaterina, they walk from where they got off the car all the way to the top of this bunny slope. And again, there's no line for this ride. It's just this operator sitting up there waiting for anybody who wants to do this thing. And so the two men, they go up and they paid $10 to the operator, who then in turn said, okay, climb inside, because the riding compartment, if you will, could hold up to 2 people. And so both Denis and Vladimir climbed inside. And after they did that, Denis actually handed his phone off to his wife, Yekaterina, and he told her, take a video of us. I want to see, what this ride looks like from the outside. And so Yekaterina, she's got her phone. She's like, okay, and she hits record and she's filming. And then, Denis and Vladimir, they got tucked up fully inside of the compartment. The operator ensured it was ready to go. And then they were off. Now, back inside the ride, once this thing had actually begun, Vladimir was actually pretty happy he had agreed to go, because this was actually really fun. He was positioned in the riding compartment, basically directly across from Denis, who, clearly he too was having a great time. He was laughing and screaming, and having a great time. But after just a few seconds, the ride seemed to change. it suddenly jerked to the left and then began going faster and faster and faster. Now, Vladimir and Denise had obviously never done this ride before, so they didn't know how it actually was supposed to feel. But Vladimir felt like there is no way this is how it's supposed to feel. This is out of control. We cannot be going this fast. This is dangerous. And so as Vladimir is really starting to worry, he looked over at Denise, who's only, a couple feet away from him, and he was not laughing and smiling anymore. He looked genuinely frightened. But before either man could really do anything at all, not that there was much they could do, the ride took one more horrible lurch, and then it just kind of slammed down hard, and then everything went black. It would turn out Vladimir's bad feeling he got when he first looked up at the bunny hill and, saw the ride basically unattended. No one was in line, no one was doing the ride. How could that be? His bad feeling about that was spot on, because the ride was not safe at all. In fact, it wasn't even legal. The operator, the one who actually put both men inside of the ride, had stolen the equipment that was the ride and then set it up in this wildly dangerous location with no safeguards. So this ride that the two friends were on was really just a giant inflatable ball called a Zorb. The idea, for this ride, for this experience, was that the riders would climb inside of the Zorb, almost like a human hamster ball, and then the Zorb would roll down the mountain like a huge slide. It was supposed to be safe and fun, but it was not. And that's because the mountain that this ride was on was just way too steep and way too rough. This was a tragedy waiting to happen. And so as Denise's and Vladimir's Zorb went flying down the hill, it bounced a few times and then just totally veered off course. This is the video that Denise's wife captured from the top of that bunny hill, basically capturing their entire descent. You can see at some point one of the workers try to chase after the Zorb as it clearly just rolls away, but they can't keep up with it. And then in the final frames, you can see the Zorb speeding towards a cliff. The Zorb did ultimately go flying off that cliff, and as it plummeted through the air, Vladimir and Denise were ejected out of it. Vladimir was severely injured but would survive. As for Denise, unfortunately, he was killed. The ride operator was arrested, but they were given just a 4-year suspended sentence for the incident. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important, but now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On April 22nd, 2025, an Indian tourist named Rishi Bhatt pulled a helmet onto his head at the top of a zipline platform in the Baisaran Valley, which is a meadow at the border of India and Pakistan. It was a very beautiful, sunny day, and way down below him, he could see crowds of people strolling around and having picnics on the grass and enjoying this awesome spring weather. However, as the zipline operator fastened the belt and rope around Rishi's waist, something started to feel off. The operator was a local man who looked pretty normal and unassuming, but he had been weirdly silent the whole time Rishi was standing in line, and it seemed like he was sort of preoccupied with something, and considering his job and how potentially dangerous it was, it just seemed like this should be his focus, getting people on and off this ride. But instead, Rishi noticed that this operator kept squinting down into the meadow really intently, like he was watching someone or something down there, but Rishi would look down and there was nothing down there that was unusual, so he couldn't understand why this operator was so fixated on whatever was going on down there. It just seemed like a normal day. And so by the time Rishi was told, like, he's ready to begin the ride here, he sort of felt like he didn't know if it was a good idea to trust this man with his safety. It just seemed like his mind was totally somewhere else. But Rishi had just watched a bunch of other people who had been, suited up by this guy, successfully navigate the zip line without any problems. And so ultimately, Rishi just sort of brushed off this budding anxiety inside of himself and just told himself he has nothing to worry about. This is going to be just fine. And so Rishi, when he was finally ready to go, he looked over at the other side to the other platform where he would eventually end up, where his wife and his 11-year-old son were, and he waved to them, sort of signaling he was going to start. And then he pulled out his phone and he hit record on the camera, and then he put it on his selfie stick and he sort of held it out, and then he jumped. And as you can see on Rishi's video, the first few seconds that capture him sort of beginning this ride, he was totally exhilarated. He's flying through the air over these breathtaking mountain views, the sun's on his face, he's laughing. But after about 20 seconds or so, Rishi heard that same zipline operator shout something from behind him. And so Rishi, he turns around and he looks back at this operator, who again is sort of like fixated looking down at like the meadow below. And he's clearly looking at something down there really intently, like he had been, but now it seemed much more urgent. And so Rishi looked from the operator down to the meadow as well, and what he saw was horrifying. He saw all these people who just moments before had been having picnics and having this just like nice casual family time. They're all screaming and running off into the trees. And at first, Rishi just couldn't understand what was happening. But then, like all the other people in the valley, he heard this terrifying noise. And suddenly he knew what was going on. When Rishi reached the end of the zip line, he immediately ripped off the belt around his waist and he grabbed his wife and his son, and they began to run. Here is the video that Rishi took that day. So the people below him, as he starts down the zip line, were mainly tourists, like Rishi and his family. And most of them, like Rishi, were from India, the country that actually has control over the area where that valley is located. And here, you can see them all start to run. What you don't see, and what we are actually blurring out here, are the 4 anti-India militants who suddenly opened fire in the valley beneath Rishi. The terrifying noise that Rishi and everyone else heard was gunfire. And the shout that Rishi heard from that sort of distracted zipline operator, well, Rishi would come to believe that that had actually been a call to action for the militants to begin their attack. Like the operator was in on it. Rishi and his family would survive this attack, but unfortunately, this was a massacre. 26 people, almost all of them Indian tourists, were killed. On the afternoon of February 20th, 2014, 27-year-old Sarah Jones walked toward a bridge that was way out in the woods of Wayne County, Georgia. The film crew that she worked with was setting up on the bridge and on the banks of the river nearby, and Sarah could also see the director pacing around, looking really stressed and kind of jittery, and was clearly barking out lots of orders to everybody around him. And Sarah was also feeling pretty stressed herself. But she took a deep breath and she told herself she just had to make it through a few more hours of this and then she could go home. So Sarah was a camera assistant, and for the longest time she'd worked in television, but recently she'd been hired to work on a movie, and the movie was being shot out here in the woods. And this job was going to be very different than what she was used to. But not just because it was the difference between movie and TV. No, it had to do with budget. So this was a movie, that was sort of prestigious in a way, but it was going to be a really low budget movie that was called Midnight Rider. And the director sort of seemed like a total mess. He kept changing his plans like all the time, especially at the last minute. And today, he had just begun outright lying to the crew. Just that morning, he told the whole crew, Sarah included, that they were heading out to this location in the woods just for a quick camera test to make sure the lenses and the lighting were right, but they weren't going to be doing any real filming. This was just pure testing. But once they got out to the bridge, the director sort of inexplicably changed his mind and said, actually, you know what, forget the test. We are going to do real filming today. We're going to shoot the whole scene for this bridge today. And this was like a really weird thing to lie about. And Sarah just didn't understand what this guy's problem was. It just seemed odd the way he was going about this. But now, it was almost 4:30 p.m. and Sarah was carrying a bag of camera lenses over to the bridge to hopefully set up for their final shots of the day. And on her way, she happened to pass by the makeup artist, whose name was Joyce Gilliard. And she noticed that Joyce had a very strange expression on her face. And so Sarah stopped and actually asked Joyce what was wrong. She's like, you look worried, what's going on? But Joyce just shook her head and said she had this funny feeling that they really were not supposed to be here. But, just a minute later, Sarah had changed the lens on the camera and she was looking through the viewfinder, and this is what she saw. The cast and crew were on this narrow bridge made of wood and metal, and there was a rickety metal hospital bed right in the middle of the bridge. It was a prop. The scene was supposed to be this dream sequence about the main character's dead brother. So the actor playing the brother was lying on the hospital bed, and the actor playing the main character was standing a little further down the bridge with a guitar slung over his shoulder. And so once everyone was in their places, Sarah passed the camera to the cinematographer, and he hoisted it onto his shoulder, and the director called for the crew to start rolling. However, at the same time, there was this deafening roar and a blast of loud noise, and Sarah felt this deep vibration through her whole body. And it was so disorienting that at first she couldn't even tell what direction it was coming from. But when she turned around, she saw the director motioning frantically for everyone to get off the bridge. And so Sarah slung the camera bag over her shoulders and tried to run, but the bridge was so crammed with people and equipment and props that she couldn't get through. And before she knew it, that horrible sound was on top of her. It would turn out Joyce was right. They weren't supposed to be there that day, but not because of anything spooky or superstitious. It was because the film crew literally was not legally allowed to be shooting a movie on this bridge. So that was the reason why the director had changed plans that day and lied about what they were doing, because his application for a permit to film on that bridge had been denied that morning. But he knew if he told his crew that it was denied, they wouldn't then be okay with going out there and doing it anyways. And so he just sort of didn't tell anyone and sort of forced the crew to do it. He tricked them all to do it, basically. But it's like the director and his crew, they're out there on the bridge, the cameras are rolling, they're about to film this final scene when disaster strikes. And the disaster that strikes was entirely predictable. It was literally the thing that this permit was denied because of. It was to avoid this type of disaster. Here is the last footage ever shot for Midnight Rider. You can see the actors and the crew scrambling to get themselves and this hospital bed off the bridge, and you can hear the roar and the blast of noise. Sarah is actually just out of frame. She's right behind the person who's holding this camera. And you can see right here the specific reason why the permit was denied. Because this bridge was an active railroad track, and there is literally a train barreling down on them. In the last few seconds of this footage, you can see the camera sort of tumbles. That's when the crew members who could not make it off the bridge in time instead pressed themselves up against the metal girders, trying to get as small and as sort of skinny as possible to avoid being hit by this train. But Sarah, unfortunately, was not fast enough. When the train came screaming by, it hit that hospital bed, and a piece of debris from it flew towards Sarah and pulled her back onto the tracks, directly into the path of the train. She was killed instantly. The rest of the crew that were on the bridge that day would survive, but a few other crew members were injured. As for the film's director, who put his whole crew in this awful situation, he pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter for Sarah's death, and he was ultimately dissecting 12 separate stories from the mid to late 1970s that will forever shatter your trust in the human race. We begin our psychological descent in the grey, damp streets of London, 1975, where a young man is about to discover that the person he loved had been systematically hunted, trapped, and slaughtered inside the one place she felt completely safe. Imagine the absolute exhaustion of a long, grueling workday fading as you finally reach your own front porch. On the early evening of the 18th of March, 1975, a 21-year-old musician named Tony Friel stood before the ground floor flat he shared with his girlfriend in Leighton, East London. He slid his key into the lock, expecting the immediate warm embrace of domestic normalcy, the smell of dinner, the comforting murmur of the radio, the soft footsteps of the woman he intended to spend the rest of his life protecting. But the moment the door creaked open, his psychological equilibrium was violently disrupted. A sudden, heavy, inexplicable chill gripped his spine. The air inside the apartment wasn't just cold. It was dead, completely frozen in a terrifying, unnatural vacuum. There were no clinking dishes, no hum of appliances, no welcoming voice. Have you ever stepped into a room and instantly known, with absolute primal certainty, that the space had been altered by pure malice? Tony stood in the threshold, paralyzed by an intrusive instinct, telling him that the darkness inside was no longer empty. The woman Tony was coming home to wasn't just an ordinary resident of East London. She was a cultural icon of her era. Eve Stratford was 22 years old, extraordinarily vibrant, and possessed a radiant magnetic beauty that had earned her a coveted position as a bunny girl at the prestigious London Playboy Club. In the mid-1970s, this role wasn't merely a job. It was an elite status symbol representing high society, absolute glamour, and exclusive luxury. Every single night, Eve navigated an intense high-stakes universe populated by velvet ropes, expensive cigars, wealthy tycoons, politicians, and the city's most powerful predatory men. She was incredibly ambitious, universally well-liked, and her future was blindingly bright. Yet the brutal psychological truth of her life was the staggering contrast between her two worlds. When her grueling shifts ended, she eagerly stripped away the satin ears, the heavy makeup, and the objectifying stares of high society monsters to retreat into the quiet, modest domesticity she shared with Tony on Lyndhurst Drive. It was her fortress, her absolute boundary against the world. But fortresses are an illusion, and safety is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. On that specific, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, Eve was seen by a neighbor around 4 o'clock walking briskly toward her flat. She was wearing a bright orange maternity-style dress, her arms full of ordinary grocery bags, looking entirely indistinguishable from any other young woman heading home to prepare a peaceful evening meal. There was absolutely nothing in her posture, nothing in her pace, and nothing in her demeanor to suggest she knew she was being actively stalked. She didn't look back. She didn't quicken her steps. Think about the sheer horror of that psychological blindness. She was mere inches away from her front door, completely unaware that a calculated, vicious predator was walking directly in her shadow, counting down the seconds until she unlocked her own prison. How many times have you walked from your car to your door, completely oblivious to the eyes tracking your every move, waiting for the perfect moment of vulnerability? Tony took a hesitant step deeper into the dark hallway and called out Eve's name, his voice echoing hollowly against the walls. No answer. He looked down and saw her heavy winter coat hanging neatly on its hook. Her shoes were kicked off near the door. She was home. She had to be home. He walked into the kitchen desperately, expecting to see a steaming pot on the stove or a half-prepared meal on the counter, but the room was entirely dark, barren, and freezing. A heavy, suffocating pressure began to tighten around his chest, that visceral, terrifying, evolutionary response that alerts us to danger before our rational brains can process it. His eyes locked onto the bedroom door at the end of the hall, which stood slightly ajar, casting a thin, sharp sliver of artificial light onto the floorboards. His heart began to hammer violently against his ribs like a panicked, trapped bird. He approached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open completely, unprepared for the psychological mutilation that awaited him on the other side. What does it do to a human mind to see the person they love reduced to a broken piece of meat? The first thing that caught Tony's fracturing sight was the bed. Eve was lying there, but her posture defied any concept of sleep or rest. Her body was angled sharply, violently across the mattress. As he stumbled forward, the horrific details sharpened into an indelible nightmare. Her slender hands had been brutally wrenched behind her back, tied together with agonizing tightness, using a pair of her own delicate silk stockings. A third stocking had been shoved deep into her mouth and wrapped around her skull as a gag pulled so brutally taut that her vibrant, beautiful features were distorted into an eternal, agonizing mask of pure terror. The air completely vanished from Tony's lungs as he collapsed toward the mattress, desperately trying to convince himself that she was merely unconscious, that she could still be saved. But when he gently moved her shoulder, the catastrophic reality exposed itself. Her throat had been hacked open with savage, relentless precision. The killer hadn't just been violent. He had been an absolute cold-blooded technician of death. Eve had been struck nearly a dozen times with a razor-sharp blade, her life violently drained into the fabric of her own sanctuary. There was no chaotic mess, no shattered furniture, no frantic signs of a prolonged struggle. There was only the devastating absolute finality of a completed execution. Tony let out a guttural sound that wasn't even human and fled blindly for the telephone. When the seasoned detectives from Scotland Yard arrived at the scene, they were immediately paralyzed by a chilling realization there was a total, unprecedented lack of physical evidence. They meticulously examined every single window, checked both entry doors, and analyzed the frames. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry. The locks were entirely intact. The glass was completely untouched. This left the investigators with two psychologically terrifying conclusions. Either Eve knew her executioner and had let him in willingly, or the killer was a master manipulator. Let's be entirely blunt about the social psychology of 1975. In that era, human beings were profoundly, naively trusting of authority. If a man knocked on your door wearing a uniform, carrying a clipboard, or posing as a delivery driver, you didn't question him. You opened the door. The killer knew this counted on it and weaponized Eve's own decency and social conditioning against her. The investigators began constructing a rigid timeline based on the fresh groceries and the condition of the flat, concluding that Eve had been ambushed almost immediately after crossing her threshold. Yet not a single neighbor heard a thing. No screams, no thuds, no desperate cries for help broke the afternoon quiet. It was as if a literal phantom had materialized inside the apartment, completed a horrific, deeply sadistic ritual, and evaporated back into the dense London fog without leaving a single fingerprint, a stray hair, or a drop of his own blood. The media immediately weaponized her job, turning the Bunny Girl murder into a sensationalized circus while the actual lead went cold. For decades, Eve Stratford's case file sat rotting in a metal cabinet, gathering dust while the world moved on. Tony tried to rebuild his shattered psyche, but how do you ever erase the mental image of the woman you loved bound by her own silk stockings? The police interviewed hundreds of people, tracking down wealthy Playboy Club members, checking local delivery routes, and interrogating known deviants, but they found absolutely nothing. The monster had committed what appeared to be the perfect isolated crime, completely slipping away into the pages of unsolved history. But what this arrogant predator didn't realize is that time is not a shield. It is a slow-burning fuse. He believed he had gotten away with it because forensic science in 1975 was fundamentally blind. He reaped the benefits of an era before digital tracking, before modern policing, and before the ultimate weapon of criminal justice was ever conceived. He thought his dark secret was safe in the past, but science was about to expose the reality of his monstrous existence. In the year 2004, nearly 30 long years after Eve's life was violently extinguished, a specialized cold case forensic team decided to utilize a highly advanced, newly developed type of DNA testing on the microscopic biological samples that had been meticulously preserved from the 1975 crime scene. Given the extreme age and degradation of the materials, the technicians expected very little. Yet against all mathematical odds, they successfully extracted a flawless, pristine DNA profile of the killer. They immediately ran that genetic code through the national database, expecting a name, a mugshot, an answer. Instead, the computer screen spat back something infinitely more horrifying. The DNA recovered from Eve's blood-soaked bedroom didn't match a known convict, but it was an absolute flawless match for another cold case file, a murder that had occurred exactly 6 months after Eve's death in an entirely different sector of London. The realization hit the detectives like a physical blow. They weren't dealing with an isolated crime of passion. That second victim was a completely innocent 16-year-old schoolgirl named Lynn Whedon. In September of 1975, Lynn was walking home from a thoroughly ordinary night out with friends when she was suddenly stalked violently, snatched from the sidewalk, and dragged into a pitch-black, isolated alleyway. There she was subjected to a level of calculated, devastating brutality that perfectly mirrored the precise, sadistic methodology used to destroy Eve Stratford. For nearly 3 decades, the police had treated these two cases as entirely separate, unrelated urban tragedies, blinded by the vast differences in the victims' ages, social circles, and lifestyles. Now the cold, hard genetic data forced them to confront a terrifying psychological truth. A highly active, disciplined serial killer had been hunting the streets of London in the mid-1970s. He was a predator who viewed women not as human beings, but as prey to be tracked, bound, and broken, and he had successfully blended back into normal society for decades. This revelation completely shattered the psychological framework of the cold case unit. This wasn't just a tragic story about a glamorous bunny girl who caught the eye of the wrong admirer. It was the terrifying reality of an apex predator who had remained entirely undetected, living among the public, perhaps raising a family, holding a job, and smiling at his neighbors while harboring the memories of 2 horrific slaughters. The fact that his DNA had never been entered into the criminal database meant something deeply unsettling. He had either stopped killing after 1975, died shortly thereafter, moved to another country, or he was so remarkably disciplined that he never got caught for another violent crime. Again. But modern investigators refuse to let him rest in the shadows. Today, police are utilizing cutting-edge investigative genetic genealogy, aggressively scanning public ancestry databases to map out the killer's entire family tree, searching for a distant cousin, a sibling, or a grandchild whose simple curiosity about their heritage will inadvertently expose him. The hunt for the monster who slaughtered Eve Stratford and Lynn Whedon remains fiercely active to this very day. The police possess a microscopic blueprint of his entire identity, a permanent, unchangeable genetic signature that proves his physical existence and cements his guilt for 2 stolen lives. They are patiently waiting for that one single family member to upload their DNA for a routine heritage test, an act that will unknowingly hand over the final key to this multi-decade mystery. It is a haunting, aggressive reminder to every hidden predator breathing air today that no matter how far you run into the past, no matter how deeply you bury your crimes, the truth has an unforgiving way of clinging to the smallest silk thread. But as the dark, rain-slicked streets of London fade into the background of our minds, we must prepare ourselves to cross an entirely different kind of border. We must travel across a fractured, paranoid European continent, moving deeply into the oppressive, suffocating shadow of the East. We cross the heavily fortified barbed wire borders of the Iron Curtain, entering a totalitarian regime where the state confidently claims to see everything, record everything, and protect everyone from the corrupt vices of the Western world. In this psychological landscape, the government insists that serial killers and horrific crimes are strictly capitalistic diseases, entirely non-existent within the perfect machinery of the socialist state. But propaganda cannot stop the monsters that dwell in the human heart. In the absolute center of a crowded, sun-drenched public square surrounded by hundreds of citizens, we find a completely different, paralyzing kind of silence. It is not the hidden, claustrophobic silence of a closed London bedroom door, but the sudden, impossible, terrifying quiet that follows a child vanishing into thin air in the literal blink of an eye. The state security apparatus will try to silence the truth, bury the files, and pretend the predator doesn't exist, but the harsh reality of human depravity cares nothing for political borders or government decrees. Think about the sheer psychological terror of realizing that the system designed to monitor your every move is completely powerless against a phantom who hunts your children. As we dive into this next dark chapter of the 1970s, ask yourself, if you cannot trust your home, if you cannot trust your neighbors, and if you cannot trust the very state that claims to guarantee your survival, what do you have left? The harsh, ugly truth of these cold cases is that the world is inherently dangerous, and the monsters who look like us are the most dangerous of all. They don't wear masks, they don't hide in the woods. They knock on your front door, they walk past you in the grocery store, and they wait patiently in the shadows of the afternoon sun. Stay incredibly close to the light, ensure your bolts are truly holding, and never ever assume that the locked door in front of you is enough to keep the real world from forcing its way inside. At 3 o'clock, on a bright Tuesday afternoon in 1975 in the heart of Sofia, Bulgaria, a 4-year-old boy named Boyan Kuchikov was tugging on his mother's sleeve. They were standing in the middle of the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral Square, one of the most famous and crowded landmarks in the entire country. To Boyan, the world was a collection of giant stone buildings, golden domes that touched the sky, and thousands of legs moving in every direction. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the air was filled with the smell of roasting nuts and the distant chime of bells. For Boyan's mother, this square was the safest place on earth. You have to understand the environment of Bulgaria in the mid-70s. This was a communist state governed by an iron fist and an omnipresent secret police force known as the Državna Sigurnost. In a city like Sofia, there were cameras, undercover agents, and informants on almost every street corner. Crimes like kidnapping simply did not happen in broad daylight because everyone was being watched at all times. It was a society built on total surveillance, which ironically gave parents a profound sense of security. Boyan was an energetic, curious little boy with a mop of dark hair and a laugh that could cut through the noise of a busy street. He was wearing a small blue jacket and sturdy little shoes that clicked against the cobblestones as he hopped from one foot to the other. His mother was holding his hand firmly, but she needed to pick up the daily newspaper from a small wooden kiosk located just a few steps away. The line was short and the sun was warm on her back. She felt completely at ease, surrounded by hundreds of her fellow citizens in the middle of a peaceful afternoon. As she reached the front of the line, she let go of Boyan's hand for just a moment to reach into her purse for some coins. She didn't think twice about it. Boyan was standing right next to her, his shoulder brushing against her hip. She could hear him humming a little tune to himself as he looked at the colorful magazines displayed on the lower rack of the kiosk. It was a mundane, domestic moment. She handed the coins to the clerk, took the folded newspaper, and tucked it under her arm. The entire transaction took approximately 45 seconds from start to finish. When she turned back and reached down to grab Boyan's hand, her fingers met nothing but thin air. She looked down at her side, expecting to see him still fascinated by the magazines, but the space next to her was empty. She did a quick 360 turn, scanning the immediate area. She figured he had spotted a pigeon or a shiny object and wandered a few feet away. After all, he was 4 years old and the square was full of distractions. She called his name, her voice calm and steady, just a mother looking for a curious child who had strayed a bit too far. There was no response. She walked 5 paces to the left, then 10 paces to the right, weaving through the groups of tourists and office workers. She called his name again, louder this time, and a few people turned to look at her with mild curiosity. The square was wide and open with very few places for a small child to hide. If he had run off, she should have been able to see his blue jacket bobbing through the crowd. But as the seconds ticked into a full minute, a cold, sharp needle of panic began to prick at the back of her neck. She began to run her eyes darting frantically between the legs of the pedestrians. She approached a group of elderly men sitting on a nearby bench and asked if they had seen a little boy in a blue jacket. They shook their heads, their expressions sympathetic but unhelpful. She ran to the edge of the square where the traffic was heavy, fearing he might have wandered toward the street. But the police officers directing the cars hadn't seen a child either. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole in the time it took to buy a piece of paper. Within 15 minutes, the mother's calm had completely shattered. She was screaming his name now, her voice raw and breaking tears streaming down her face as she grabbed strangers by their coats, begging them for information. A crowd began to gather, and soon the local police arrived. Because of the location and the nature of the era, the response was immediate and massive. They didn't just send a few officers. They locked down the entire sector. They knew that in a city like Sofia, a child couldn't just vanish without someone seeing something. The secret police, the Državna Sigurnost, took over the investigation within the hour. This is where the story shifts from a tragic accident into something much more chilling. These were men who specialized in knowing the secrets of every citizen. They had informants in every apartment building and cameras on every major thoroughfare. They immediately blocked all the exit points out of the city. They searched every bus, every train, and every car leaving the capital. They interviewed hundreds of people who had been in the square at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The investigators were methodical. They measured the distance from the kiosk to the nearest street. They calculated that for a 4-year-old to reach a vehicle and be driven away, it would have taken at least 2 minutes of walking and several more to navigate the crowd. Yet the mother had only looked away for 45 seconds. This created what the police called an impossible window. In a space filled with hundreds of people, not a single witness reported seeing a man carrying a crying child or a boy being led away by a stranger. It was a total forensic vacuum. Days turned into weeks, and the search expanded across the entire country. Thousands of posters with Boyan's face were plastered on walls from the Black Sea coast to the mountain villages. The state-controlled media, which usually suppressed news of crime to maintain the illusion of a socialist utopia, actually allowed the story to be broadcast. They wanted the public's help. But despite the massive reach of the government, not a single credible lead ever materialized. No clothing was found, no sightings were confirmed, and no ransom demands were ever made. The mother's life became a frozen landscape of grief and unanswered questions. Every day she returned to the square, standing by the same newsstand, hoping to see a flash of a blue jacket in the crowd. She began to notice things that didn't make sense. The police, who had been so aggressive at the start, suddenly became tight-lipped. When she went to the station for updates, the officers would look at the floor and tell her there was nothing new. It felt like a heavy, invisible curtain was being drawn across her son's existence, and she couldn't understand why. Rumors began to circulate through the whispers of the Sofia underground. In a country where the elite lived by a different set of rules, some people suggested that Boyan hadn't been kidnapped by a common criminal. There were stories of high-ranking officials who were unable to have children of their own men with the power to make the police look the other way. Others whispered about international trafficking rings that operated with the silent consent of the state. These were dangerous things to say out loud, but they were the only explanations that fit the impossible nature of the disappearance. For 15 years, the mother lived under the shadow of the communist regime, unable to push for more information without risking her own safety. But in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the communist government in Bulgaria collapsed shortly after. As the old structures of power were dismantled, the new democratic government promised transparency. They began to open the archives of the secret police, allowing citizens to see the files that had been kept on them for decades. The mother was among the first in line, her heart pounding with the hope of finally finding the truth. She spent months navigating the labyrinth of the National Archives, looking for the file labeled with her son's name. When she finally found it, she was ushered into a small, cold room with a single light bulb. An archivist handed her a thin folder. Her hands shook as she opened it, expecting to see hundreds of pages of witness statements, suspect profiles, and forensic reports. After all, the secret police had claimed to have conducted the largest manhunt in Bulgarian history. She expected to see the mechanical details of a massive state investigation. Instead, the folder was almost entirely empty. There were a few initial reports from the first 48 hours, and then nothing. There were no follow-up interviews, no records of the border checks, no lists of suspects. Most disturbingly, several pages appeared to have been neatly razor-cut out of the binding, leaving only the jagged edges behind. The file didn't just show a lack of evidence, it showed an active, deliberate erasure. It was as if someone had gone through the records and scrubbed away any mention of where the investigation had actually led. This revelation was perhaps more painful than the disappearance itself. It confirmed her worst fears that her son hadn't just been lost in a crowd but had been taken by someone with the power to silence the most powerful police force in the country. If the Državna Sigurnost didn't have a record of who took him, it was because they already knew exactly who it was, and they were forbidden from writing it down. Boyan Kuchukov would be a man in his 50s today, and to this day his mother still wonders if he is out there living a life under a different name. The case remains the most famous mystery in Bulgarian history, a haunting reminder of a time when the state could make a person vanish, as if they were never there at all. The square is still there, the cathedral domes still glow in the sun, and mothers still hold their children's hands a little tighter when they pass the newsstand. The silence of the archives is the only answer the family ever received, leaving a void where a little boy in a blue jacket used to be. It is a story of a disappearance that was not just physical but political. As we leave the cold, empty files of Sofia behind, we move from the wide-open spaces of a public square to the claustrophobic density of another city across the world. We travel to Hong Kong, a place where millions of people live stacked on top of one another in towering apartment blocks. Here the mystery isn't about someone vanishing in a crowd, but about someone who was hidden in plain sight behind a door that was never supposed to be opened in a room where the rent was always paid on time. At 8 o'clock on a humid Tuesday morning in May of 1977, the bustling streets of Causeway Bay, Hong Kong were already a chaotic symphony of ringing tram bells and shouting street vendors. In this vertical city where millions of people lived, stacked on top of one another in aging, concrete towers, rhythm was everything. If you were even 1 minute late for your routine, the city seemed to notice. And on this particular morning, the city noticed that a young woman named Miss Lee was missing. Miss Lee was a 26-year-old primary school teacher who was the very definition of reliability. She lived alone in a small, tidy apartment on Yi Wo Street, a place where the neon signs from the shops below glowed against her curtains all night long. She didn't have many friends, and she didn't lead a flashy life. Her world revolved around her students, her lesson plans, and the quiet sanctuary of her home. To her neighbors, she was a polite shadow who moved through the hallways with a gentle nod. Every single morning for 3 years, Miss Lee had walked through the front gates of her school at exactly 8:15. She would have her wooden pointer in one hand and a stack of graded papers in the other, her hair pinned back perfectly. She was a woman who found comfort in the predictable. So when the school bell rang at 8:30 and Miss Lee's classroom remained dark and silent, a ripple of genuine unease spread through the faculty lounge. It was as if a gear in a massive clock had suddenly stopped turning. By noon, the principal of the school was standing in the administrative office holding a heavy black telephone receiver to his ear. He had called Miss Lee's home number 6 times, and each time it had simply rung into an empty void. He knew that Miss Lee lived alone, and he knew she had no history of illness or family emergencies. He felt a cold prickle of worry on the back of his neck. In a city as crowded as Hong Kong, disappearing was supposed to be impossible, yet one of his best teachers had simply evaporated. 2 days passed, and the silence from the apartment on Yi Wo Street became a heavy physical presence. The neighbors began to talk in hushed tones in the stairwells. They noticed that the small pile of mail tucked into Miss Lee's doorframe was growing thicker, and the light that usually filtered through the gap at the bottom of her door remained dark. But then, on the 3rd day, the environment changed. It started with a smell. It wasn't the sharp metallic scent of the city, but something different, something sweet, heavy, and sickly. It was a scent that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. One neighbor, an elderly man who lived directly across the hall, described it as the smell of 1,000 mothballs mixed with something much darker, something that reminded him of a damp basement that had been sealed for a century. He stood in the hallway, his heart racing, and pressed his ear to Miss Lee's door. He heard nothing. No television, no footsteps, no rustle of clothing. Just a silence so absolute that it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. The landlord was summoned, a man who had seen everything in the cramped tenements of Causeway Bay. He arrived with a heavy ring of keys and a sense of mounting dread. He knocked loudly, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway, but there was no response. With a shaking hand, he slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open just a few inches before it hit something. He pushed harder, and as the door swung wide, the smell hit him like a physical blow, making his eyes water and his stomach churn. The apartment was perfectly clean. The bed was made with military precision, the kitchen counters were wiped down, and Miss Lee's books were lined up neatly on the shelves. To a casual observer, it looked like she had just stepped out for a moment. But as the landlord and a few brave neighbors stepped further into the small living area, their eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room. There sat a massive, dark wooden wardrobe that seemed out of place. It was a heavy piece of furniture, easily 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. As they moved closer, they realized the wardrobe had been modified in a way that defied all logic. The 2 large doors, which should have swung open easily, were sealed. Every single seam and crack where the wood met had been filled with a thick, translucent, industrial-grade glue. Long, jagged nails had been driven through the frames at irregular intervals, as if someone had been in a frantic hurry to make sure whatever was inside would never, ever get out. The sight of it made the landlord's breath hitch in his throat. The police were called immediately, and within the hour, 2 detectives were standing in the small apartment staring at the barricaded wardrobe. The smell of mothballs was so overpowering now that they had to cover their faces with handkerchiefs. One detective took a crowbar to the top of the wardrobe, leaning his full weight into it. The wood groaned and splintered the industrial glue, stretching like taffy before finally snapping. As the first door began to give way, a white cloud of fine powder spilled out onto the floor. The powder was crushed mothballs, hundreds of them, creating a chemical mist that filled the room. When the doors were finally wrenched open, the detectives stumbled back their boots, sliding on the white dust. Inside the wardrobe, wrapped in layer upon layer of heavy industrial plastic, was the body of Miss Lee. She was positioned upright, her head tilted slightly to the side as if she were listening to a distant sound. Her hands were bound in front of her and her eyes were closed. She looked less like a victim and more like a macabre preserved statue. The autopsy would later reveal that Miss Lee had been strangled, but the violence of her death was almost overshadowed by what happened afterward. The killer had spent hours, perhaps even days, meticulously preparing her body. He had wrapped her in plastic to prevent the scent of decay from alerting the neighbors, and he had used the mothballs as a chemical preservative. But the most disturbing detail didn't come from the medical examiner. It came from the landlord, who was looking through his records back at his office. The landlord realized with a jolt of pure terror that the rent for Miss Lee's apartment had been paid in full for the 2 months following her disappearance. Every 2 weeks, an envelope containing the exact amount of cash had been slid under his office door in the middle of the night. Someone had been coming back to the building, walking past the neighbors, and paying for the apartment to ensure that no one would have a reason to go inside. Someone was treating Miss Lee's apartment not as a crime scene, but as a private permanent shrine. The investigation quickly turned to the other residents of the building. The detectives began to look for someone who had access to industrial glue and someone who had been seen in the hallways during the late-night hours. They found their man in a unit just 2 floors down. He was a quiet, unassuming laborer who worked at a nearby construction site. When they searched his room, they found a collection of Miss Lee's personal items, a hairbrush, a single earring, and a photograph of her standing in front of her school. He had become obsessed with her from a distance, watching her daily routine from the shadows of the stairwell until he finally worked up the courage to break into her sanctuary. He didn't want to steal her money or her jewelry. He wanted her presence. After he killed her, he couldn't bear the thought of her being taken away, so he built the wardrobe, sealed her inside, and continued to pay her rent as if she were still there, living her quiet life behind the nailed-shut doors. He had turned her home into a tomb and himself into its silent caretaker. The story of the cupboard murder became a legend in Hong Kong, a dark reminder of the thin walls and hidden obsessions that thrive in a city of millions. To this day, people walking down Yiwo Street sometimes look up at the aging windows of that 4th-floor apartment and wonder if the smell of mothballs still lingers in the wood. It is the ultimate suburban nightmare, the idea that your life could be taken, your home turned into a prison, and the world would keep turning as long as the rent was paid on time. As the dense vertical towers of Hong Kong begin to blur into the night, we leave the claustrophobia of the city behind and travel across the ocean. We move toward the sprawling landscapes of Western Germany, where the air is colder and the stakes are much higher. We are no longer looking at a hidden tomb in a small apartment, but at a high-stakes game of political chess, where a powerful man is held in a different kind of box, a human pawn in a struggle between a government that refuses to bend and a group of radicals who have already decided his fate. In the early weeks of 1977, a man named Primitivo Mijares, known to his friends as Tebow, sat in a small apartment in San Francisco watching the fog roll in off the bay. At 52 years old, Tebow was a man who lived with a permanent weight on his shoulders. He was a journalist by trade, but for years he had been something much more significant. He had been the chief propagandist for the most powerful man in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos. He was the insider who had helped craft the image of a perfect regime, but now he was a man living in a self-imposed exile. Tebow's daily routine in California was a stark contrast to his high-flying life in Manila. Instead of moving through the corridors of power, he spent his hours hunched over a typewriter, pouring out every secret he had ever kept. He knew about the hidden bank accounts, the rigged elections, and the quiet disappearances of political rivals. He knew so much that he had become a liability to the very people he once served. He had recently published a book titled The Conjugal Dictatorship, a devastating exposé that stripped away the mask of the Philippine government. The publication of that book was effectively a signed death warrant, and Tebow knew it. He lived with a constant sense of paranoia, checking over his shoulder every time he walked down the street. He changed his phone number frequently and rarely stayed in the same place for long. But despite the danger, there was a part of him that felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't lying. He was telling the truth, and he believed that being on American soil offered him a shield that the regime back home couldn't penetrate. However, in January of 1977, that shield began to feel incredibly thin. Thibault received a series of phone calls that weren't threats, which was what he expected. Instead, they were invitations. High-ranking officials from the Philippines reached out with a surprising message. They claimed that the president missed his old friend. They offered him a full pardon, a safe return to his home country, and a chance to reconcile. It was a tempting offer for a man who missed his family and the vibrant life he had left behind in the islands. The logic Thibault used to reassure himself was simple. He believed that because he was now a public figure in the United States, the regime wouldn't dare touch him. He thought that his international profile made him too big to disappear. He told his friends and family that he was going to Guam for a brief meeting to finalize the details of his return. He packed a small suitcase, kissed his wife, and promised his youngest son, a 16-year-old boy named Boyet, that he would be back before they knew it. On a humid afternoon in late January, Thibault landed at the airport in Guam. He was greeted by several men in suits who seemed friendly enough, though they were notably quiet. They escorted him to a waiting vehicle and informed him that the plans had changed slightly. They told him that for his own safety and to avoid any public spectacle, the meeting would actually take place in a more secure location back in Manila. Thibault felt a sudden sharp pang of unease in his chest, but he was already inside the car and the doors were locked. As the plane touched down at the Manila International Airport, Thibault looked out the window at the familiar tropical landscape. Usually as a high-ranking official, he would have been greeted with a motorcade and a red carpet. But this time the tarmac was almost entirely empty. There were no reporters, no family members, and no welcoming committee. Just a group of military intelligence officers standing beside a nondescript black sedan. As he stepped off the stairs, the heat of the city hit him like a physical blow, and the silence felt heavy and suffocating. The officers didn't speak as they took Thibault's luggage and guided him toward the car. There was no paperwork to sign, no customs check, and no official entry record. It was as if he were being erased from the moment his feet touched the ground. Thibault looked around, his eyes searching for a familiar face, a witness, anyone who could verify that he had arrived. But the area had been cleared of all personnel. He was pushed into the back seat of the sedan, and as the car sped away from the terminal, Primitivo Mijares simply vanished from the face of the earth. For months, Thibault's family in the Philippines waited for news. They called his contacts in San Francisco, but no one had seen him. They reached out to the government, but the official response was always the same. They had no record of him entering the country. The silence was a psychological torture that tore the family apart, but for 16-year-old Boyet, the youngest and most devoted of Thibault's children, the disappearance wasn't an ending. It was a mystery he was determined to solve. He believed his father was alive, held in secret, and waiting for him. In May of 1977, 4 months after Thibault vanished, the telephone in the Mijares family home rang. Boyet answered it. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. The caller claimed to be a friend of his father's, a man working within the military. He told Boyet that Thibault was being held in a safe house and that he was asking to see his son. The caller gave Boyet a specific time and a location in Manila where he could be picked up. He warned the boy not to tell anyone, especially the police, or his father's life would be in danger. Boyet didn't hesitate. He was young, hopeful, and fueled by a desperate need to see his father again. He told his mother he was going out to see some friends and left the house in a hurry. He arrived at the designated meeting spot, a quiet street corner near a park. A car pulled up exactly as the caller had described. Boyet climbed into the back seat, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. He thought he was minutes away from a reunion that would finally end the nightmare his family had been living through. But as the car pulled away, the environment inside the vehicle changed instantly. The men in the front seat dropped the friendly act. They didn't talk about his father. They didn't tell him where they were going. One of the men turned around and handed Boyet a blindfold, telling him that for security reasons he couldn't see the route to the safe house. Boyet felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He realized far too late that he hadn't been invited to a reunion. He had been lured into the same trap that had swallowed his father. Weeks passed without any word from Boyet. The Mijares family was now grieving 2 disappearances. The police offered no help, and the government remained a wall of silence. Then, in June, a group of hikers in a rural area outside of Manila discovered a body dumped in a shallow ravine. It was a young male, and the condition of the remains was so horrific that it made the local authorities pause. The victim had been subjected to a level of brutality that suggested the goal wasn't just murder, but the delivery of a message. The body was identified as 16-year-old Boye Mijares. He had been tortured in ways that are difficult to describe. His eyeballs had been plucked out, his head had been bashed in with a heavy object, and there were dozens of puncture wounds across his torso. The investigators noted that the nature of the injuries was consistent with the psychological warfare tactics used by military intelligence units at the time. It was a ritualistic, visceral form of violence designed to break the spirit of anyone who dared to stand against the regime. The truth of what happened to Thibault and Boyet began to trickle out only years later after the fall of the dictatorship in 1986. Eyewitness accounts from former military detainees began to surface. Several men claimed that they had seen a middle-aged man matching Thibault's description being held in a black site, a secret military prison. They described seeing him being forced to watch through a two-way mirror as his son was tortured in the next room. The regime didn't just want to kill Thibault. They wanted him to watch the consequences of his betrayal. Primitivo Mijares' body was never recovered. He remains one of the thousands of desaparecidos from that era of Philippine history. The official records of his arrival in Manila were destroyed, and no one was ever prosecuted for his disappearance or the murder of his son. The case is a haunting reminder of the man who knew too much a whistleblower, who thought his truth would protect him, only to find that the shadows he had helped create were longer and darker than he could have ever imagined. As the humid, heavy air of Manila settles over the unrecovered remains of a father and son, we travel south. We move from the political safe houses of a dictatorship to the rugged, sun-bleached landscapes of Australia. Here, the danger isn't found in the halls of government or in the pages of an exposé. Instead, it is found in the ordinary routine of a daily commute where 6 different women will step onto a train or a sidewalk, expecting a quiet journey home, only to find that the landscape itself is hiding a predator. At 5:30 in the afternoon on a crisp Tuesday in August of 1977, 73-year-old Bertha Miller was beginning her daily walk home from the Glen Waverley train station in a quiet suburb of Melbourne, Australia. Bertha was a woman of deep, unwavering habit, known for her sharp mind and her love for the leafy, peaceful streets of her neighborhood. To her, this 10-minute stroll was the best part of her day, a time to decompress and enjoy the winter air before dinner. The streets were familiar and felt as safe as her own living room. She knew exactly which houses had barking dogs and which of her neighbors would be out tending to their gardens at this hour. But as she crossed the intersection of High Street, Bertha noticed a white van idling at the curb. It was not a vehicle she recognized from the area, and the engine was running with a low, rhythmic thrum. She did not see a driver through the glass, but she felt a sudden, sharp prickle of awareness. She told herself it was just a delivery driver taking a break or someone waiting for a passenger from the next train. She adjusted her heavy wool coat, clutched her handbag a little tighter, and kept walking. However, a block later she heard the van pull away from the curb. It did not speed past her. Instead, it crawled along at a walking pace, staying exactly 10 yards behind her. Bertha's heartbeat began to quicken, a small, frantic drumbeat of anxiety starting to echo in her chest. She was only 4 houses away from her front door when the van finally accelerated. It did not turn at the corner, it just seemed to vanish into the gathering twilight. Bertha made it inside, locked her door, and leaned against it for a long minute, waiting for her breathing to return to normal. She dismissed the event as a trick of her nerves. After all, nothing ever happened in this part of Melbourne. But that night, as she prepared for bed, the silence of the street outside felt different. By the next morning, Bertha Miller's family was frantic. She had not called her daughter as she did every evening, and when they arrived at her home, they found her keys on the table and her bed unslept in. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and simply ceased to exist. The police were notified, but they were already struggling with a similar report from the week before. Another woman had disappeared near a train station just a few miles away, leaving behind no clues. The fear in the suburbs of Melbourne began to grow from a whisper to a roar. Over the next few months, 4 more women would vanish. They were all linked by one common thread. They were using public transport or walking near train stations in the southeast corridor when they disappeared. The victims were not just one age or demographic. They ranged from a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Catherine to a 63-year-old grandmother. The killer was not choosing a type. he was choosing a location. Catherine Headland was only 14 years old when she set out to visit her boyfriend on a Saturday afternoon in August. She was a bright, popular girl who knew the train lines like the back of her hand. She told her mother she would be back by 6 o'clock, and she was last seen walking toward the Berwick station. She was wearing a distinctive blue jacket and carrying a small bag. She never made it to the platform. Witness accounts were vague, mentioning only a dark vehicle idling nearby. As the list of the missing grew to 6, the city felt like it was under siege. Women began carrying whistles and walking in large groups. The police launched Operation Tynong, one of the largest investigations in Australian history. They interviewed over 2,000 people, focusing on delivery drivers, gardeners, and anyone whose job gave them a reason to be lingering near train stations. They looked for a man who moved invisibly through the suburbs, a predator who knew the schedules better than the commuters. For 3 years, the cases remained cold. There were no bodies, no ransom notes, and no suspects. The families were left in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn and unable to move on. They lived in the not knowing a place where every ringing phone or knock at the door was a source of both hope and terror. Then in December of 1980, the silence was finally broken in a way that no one was prepared for. It started with a group of hunters in a remote area called Tynong North. Tynong North was a rugged, heavily forested region about 40 miles outside of Melbourne. It was the kind of place people went to get lost, full of deep ravines and dense scrubland that were nearly impossible to navigate without a four-wheel drive vehicle. The hunters were tracking a scent when they stumbled upon a clearing. There, partially hidden by the undergrowth, were human remains. They weren't just the remains of one person. They had stumbled into a secret graveyard in the middle of the bush. The forensic teams spent weeks meticulously sifting through the dirt. They found the skeletal remains of 3 women at the first site. A few months later, another 3 bodies were found at a separate location nearby. The discovery confirmed everyone's worst nightmare. The missing women had been taken to this desolate place, far from the safety of the suburbs, and discarded like refuse. The autopsy reports were limited by the passage of time, but one chilling detail stood out to the investigators. Several items of personal jewelry were missing from the bodies. While their clothing had mostly rotted away, the rings and necklaces they had been wearing on the days they vanished were gone. It suggested that the killer had kept them as trophies, small mementos of the lives he had stolen. The choice of the disposal site also provided a major clue. Tynong North was not a place you found by accident. You had to know the logging trails and the hidden clearings. The killer was a local. The investigation shifted its focus to men who had intimate knowledge of the rural Victoria landscape. They looked for someone whose vehicle was capable of off-road travel and whose work schedule allowed them to be in the suburbs during the day and in the bush at night. A specific person of interest began to emerge, a man who worked as a delivery driver in the southeast suburbs during the 1970s. He was a handyman who often took jobs in the Tynong North area helping to clear land. This man had a history of petty crime and a reputation for being a loner. When the police interviewed him, they found that his stories didn't quite align with his work logs. However, in the early 80s, DNA technology did not exist. There was no physical evidence linking him to the bodies in the scrubland, and without a confession, the police were stuck. They watched him for years, waiting for him to make a mistake, but he remained silent. The case stalled, and the public's attention eventually drifted away. Decades passed, but the Victorian Cold Case Unit never truly gave up. In 2017, they took a massive step by offering a $6 million reward for information leading to a conviction. This was the largest reward ever offered in the state's history. They hoped that the passage of time would loosen the tongues of those who might have known the killer. They also began a new round of DNA testing on the clothing remnants found at the scene, using technology that was unthinkable in 1980. The new testing focused on touch DNA, the microscopic skin cells left behind by a person's fingers. They were looking for a signature on the fabric of the victim's clothing. While they have managed to create a partial profile, the case remains one of Australia's most notorious unsolved mysteries. The man who was once the primary suspect has since passed away, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But the police believe there are others who know exactly what happened in those woods all those years ago. For the families of the 6 women, the resolution is still out of reach. They are left with the haunting image of the Tynong North scrubland, a place that held their loved ones for 3 years while the rest of the world kept looking in the wrong direction. The mystery remains a dark stain on the history of Melbourne, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look like they belong exactly where they are, waiting at the edge of a quiet suburban routine. As the silence of the Australian bush settles over the unmarked clearings of Tynong North, we leave the rugged landscape of Victoria behind. We travel across the vast expanse of the ocean, moving toward the vibrant, high-energy streets of Brazil. Here the danger is not found in the shadows of a train station or in the dense scrubland of the country. Instead, it is found in the high-speed roar of a modern highway where a national hero is about to meet an end that might not be as accidental as it seems. At 6 o'clock on a humid, rain-slicked Sunday evening in August of 1976, a man named Geraldo Ribeiro was gripping the steering wheel of a metallic gold Chevrolet Opala. He was driving down the Via Dutra, the high-speed artery connecting the massive sprawl of Sao Paulo to the coastal beauty of Rio de Janeiro. For Geraldo, this was not just another job. He was a professional driver, but today he was protecting the most important passenger in Brazil. In the back seat sat Juscelino Kubitschek, or JK as the nation called him. He was the former president, the visionary, who had literally carved the capital city of Brasilia out of the wilderness. To many, he was the symbol of a golden age of democracy and progress. But to the military dictatorship currently holding the country in an iron grip, he was something else entirely. He was a threat. He was a man whose influence could not be allowed to return to the public stage. Geraldo looked into the rearview mirror and saw JK resting his head against the window, watching the blur of the passing trees. The highway was busy, filled with families returning from their weekend trips and heavy trucks hauling freight across the interior. The Opala was a powerful car, and Geraldo handled it with a surgeon's precision. He had driven for JK for many years, and there was a quiet, unspoken bond of trust between the two men. It was a partnership of silence. The atmosphere inside the car was peaceful, a small bubble of security moving through a country that felt increasingly dangerous. JK had been living under the watchful eye of the secret police for a long time. His phones were tapped, his meetings were monitored, and his movements were tracked by men in nondescript suits. But here on the open road it felt like they could breathe. The hum of the tires on the wet pavement was the only sound rhythmic and hypnotic. Geraldo checked his gauges and adjusted his mirrors. The rain was light, just a fine mist that required the wipers to move every few seconds. He noticed a large intercity bus up ahead, a Cometa Line vehicle painted in bright stripes. It was moving at a steady pace in the right lane. Geraldo checked his left, saw it was clear, and began to accelerate to overtake the bus. It was a standard maneuver, something he had done thousands of times on this exact stretch of road. As the Opala drew level with the middle of the bus, something changed. It wasn't a sound or a sudden movement, but a feeling in the air. Geraldo felt the car shudder slightly, as if a sudden gust of wind had pushed against the side of the vehicle. He tightened his grip on the wheel, expecting the car to settle. But instead of straightening out, the Opala began to drift. It wasn't a slow drift. It was a sharp, aggressive pull toward the massive wheels of the speeding bus. He glanced over and saw the gleaming chrome of the bus's hubcaps just inches away from his passenger door. Geraldo reacted instantly, steering away from the bus, but the car felt heavy and unresponsive. In that split second, he looked up and caught the eye of the bus driver through the glass. The man's expression was not one of panic or surprise. It was a look of intense, cold focus. Then came the sound, a sharp metallic screech, as the two vehicles finally made contact. The gold Opala clipped the side of the bus, and the impact was enough to send the car into a violent spin. Geraldo fought the steering wheel, his muscles straining, as he tried to regain control of the sliding vehicle. Beside him in the back, JK was thrown across the seat. The world outside the windows became a kaleidoscope of gray sky and blurred asphalt. The car crossed the median strip, sliding sideways into the path of the oncoming traffic heading toward Sao Paulo. Coming from the opposite direction was a heavy truck, its headlights glowing like the eyes of a monster in the darkening evening. The driver of the truck slammed on his brakes, but there was no time to stop thousands of pounds of moving steel. The Opala spun directly into the front of the truck. The sound of the collision was deafening, a roar of folding metal and shattering glass that echoed across the valley. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the highway fell into a terrifying silence. Witnesses ran from their cars, their feet splashing in the puddles. They found the gold Opala crushed almost beyond recognition. Geraldo Ribeiro and Juscelino Kubitschek were both killed instantly. Within minutes, the military police arrived on the scene. They didn't just cordon off the area, they took total control of the environment. They moved with a speed and coordination that suggested they were expecting a call. Before the sun had even fully set, the official narrative was already being written. The government released a statement almost immediately. It was a tragic accident caused by a reckless maneuver on a rain-slicked road. They blamed the driver Geraldo, suggesting he had lost control of the vehicle. The case was closed with a speed that left the public stunned. JK was a national hero, and yet there was no deep investigation, no forensic recreation of the crash, and no transparency. For 20 years, the silence of the state was the only answer the family received. But the accident never sat right with the people of Brazil. Rumors began to circulate that JK had been a target of Operation Condor, a secret campaign of political assassinations coordinated by the military dictatorships of South America. People whispered that the car had been tampered with, or that something had happened to Geraldo before the crash. In 1996, a new investigation was opened, but the experts once again ruled it an accident, citing a lack of physical evidence. The breakthrough didn't come until 21 years later in 2013. A municipal truth commission in Sao Paulo decided to do the one thing no one had dared to do. They exhumed the remains of Geraldo Ribeiro. They wanted to see if the driver's body held any secrets that the car's wreckage had hidden. When the forensic team examined the driver's skull, they found something that stopped the entire investigation in its tracks. It was a small, rusted metallic fragment. The fragment was lodged deep in the bone of the forehead. The experts analyzed its composition and found that it was not a piece of the car's dashboard or a shard of the windshield glass. It was lead. Specifically, it was consistent with a bullet. The theory was explosive. Geraldo hadn't lost control of the car. He had been shot from a distance, or perhaps from a vehicle driving alongside him, causing him to slump over the wheel and send the Opala into the path of the bus. This discovery suggested that the accident was actually a perfectly timed execution. The bus had not just been in the way, it had been a tool used to force the car into the oncoming truck. However, just 1 year later, a National Truth Commission released a conflicting report. They argued that the metallic fragment was actually a rusted nail from the coffin or a piece of debris that had entered the grave over time. They stood by the original ruling of a traffic accident. To this day, the debate divides the country. Some see a tragic skid on a dark road, while others see the cold hand of a government that could not allow a symbol of democracy to live. The truth is buried somewhere in the wet asphalt of the Via Dutra, hidden in the silence of the men who were there that night. The golden Opala is gone, and the visionary who built the capital of the future was silenced on a highway that led nowhere. It remains Brazil's greatest political ghost story. As the rain continues to wash over the memorial on that lonely stretch of Brazilian highway, the sound of high-speed travel begins to shift. The roar of tires on pavement fades, replaced by the high-pitched whine of an aircraft engine. We move from the ground to the sky, traveling thousands of miles across the Pacific to the heart of Tokyo. Here a man is also looking for a way to change history, but he isn't using a car on a highway. He is aiming a plane at a house. At 9 o'clock on a clear, breezy Tuesday morning in March of 1976, a 29-year-old man named Mitsuyasu Maino arrived at the small Chofu airport on the outskirts of Tokyo. He was dressed in a way that immediately drew eyes, though not necessarily with suspicion. He was wearing a dark, vintage military-style flight suit, complete with a white headband tied tightly around his forehead. In any other context, he would have looked like a ghost from the 1940s, but in Tokyo's booming film industry, this was just another Tuesday. To the staff at the airfield, Maino was a familiar face. He was a minor actor, mostly working in the gritty, low-budget world of adult cinema and B-movies, and he often talked about his dreams of cinematic glory. When he approached the rental counter to sign out a Piper Cherokee aircraft, he looked the clerk in the eye with a calm, professional confidence. He explained that he was heading up for some promotional shots for a new film project. He even had a photographer with him, which made the whole scene feel like a standard day on a movie set. The atmosphere at the airport was peaceful and routine. Mechanics were tinkering with engines in nearby hangars, and the smell of aviation fuel hung heavy and sweet in the morning air. Maino went through the pre-flight checklist with a practiced hand. He had been a licensed pilot for several years, and he took pride in his technical skills. He checked the fuel levels, tested the control surfaces, and climbed into the cockpit. To anyone watching from the terminal, he was just a young man at the height of his career, ready to take to the skies for his craft. Now, to understand why Mitsuyasu Maino was in that cockpit, you have to understand the world he lived in. The mid-70s were a time of massive upheaval in Japan. The country was reeling from the Lockheed bribery scandal, a political explosion that had revealed deep-seated corruption at the highest levels of government. For many people, it felt like the traditional soul of the nation was being sold off to the highest bidder. For an actor like Mano, who was deeply obsessed with the old codes of honor and the Bushido spirit, this corruption was more than just a news story. It was a personal insult. He had spent years playing roles that didn't matter, working in an industry that felt hollow and cheap. He often sat in his small apartment surrounded by books on Japanese history and posters of heroic warriors, feeling like he was a man out of time. He wanted his life to mean something. He wanted to perform an act so significant and so pure that it would wash away the perceived filth of the modern world. He began to focus his resentment on one man in particular, Yoshio Kodama. Kodama was a billionaire fixer, a man who pulled the strings behind the scenes and was a central figure in the Lockheed scandal. As Mano taxied the Piper Cherokee toward the runway, he wasn't thinking about camera angles or lighting. He was feeling the weight of the aircraft, the vibration of the engine through the seat of his flight suit, and the tightness of the headband across his brow. He was 29 years old, a time when most men are just starting to build their futures, but Mano felt like his future had already been written. He looked over at his photographer in the passenger seat and gave a sharp, determined nod. It was time to go. The tower cleared him for takeoff, and he pushed the throttle forward. The plane climbed steadily into the crisp Tokyo sky, leaving the industrial sprawl of the city behind. For the first 20 minutes, the flight was perfectly normal. Mano performed a few gentle turns over the bay, allowing the photographer to snap pictures of him against the horizon. The sun was reflecting off the silver wings of the plane, and for a moment the world felt incredibly vast and beautiful. But as they leveled off at 3,000 feet, Mano's demeanor began to shift. The professional mask of the actor started to slip, replaced by a cold, glassy stare that the photographer found unsettling. Mano began to speak into the radio, but he wasn't talking to the control tower. He was recording a message, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. He spoke about the betrayal of the emperor, the loss of national pride, and the need for a final purification. The photographer, realizing that this wasn't part of the script, began to ask questions, his voice rising in pitch. Mano didn't answer him. He simply banked the plane toward the Setagaya Ward, a high-end residential district where the city's elite lived in sprawling mansions behind high stone walls. He was looking for a specific roof, a traditional Japanese-style estate that sat on a massive plot of land. This was the home of Yoshio Kodama. Mano had studied maps of the area until he could navigate it in his sleep. He knew exactly where Kodama's bedroom was located on the second floor. As the mansion came into view, the quiet hum of the cabin was replaced by the frantic shouting of the photographer. Mano reached over and switched off the intercom. He wanted his final moments to be silent, a focused meditation on the target rushing toward him at over 100 miles per hour. The wrongness of the situation was now undeniable. A small civilian aircraft was circling one of the most protected residential areas in the world at a dangerously low altitude. Witnesses on the ground looked up, shielding their eyes from the sun, expecting the plane to pull up at any second. They saw the white headband and the dark flight suit through the cockpit glass. They saw the plane tip its wings in a final, eerie salute. Then, instead of gaining altitude, Mano dipped the nose of the Piper Cherokee directly toward the center of the Kodama estate. In those final seconds, time seemed to stretch for everyone involved. Mano could see the individual tiles on the roof and the manicured trees in the garden. He felt the controls stiffen as the wind resistance built up. He was no longer an actor playing a part. He had become the role. He was a kamikaze pilot in 1976, bringing a forgotten war into the heart of a modern city. He didn't blink. He didn't scream. He simply held the line, aiming for the window where he believed the traitor was sleeping. The engine roared, a final defiant note, as the plane cleared the perimeter wall. The impact was a massive concussive explosion that shattered the morning peace of the neighborhood. The aircraft tore through the second floor of the mansion, its wings shearing off as it buried itself deep into the structure. A ball of fire erupted from the ruptured fuel tanks, sending a plume of black smoke billowing into the sky. The sound was heard for miles, a thunderous crack that brought people running from their homes. For a moment, it looked like Mano had achieved his goal, a surgical strike against the man he blamed for the nation's decline. But here is where the story takes its most ironic turn. Mitsuyasu Mano was killed instantly in the crash, his life ending in the fiery climax he had so carefully planned. However, Yoshio Kodama, the billionaire target of his rage, was not in the bedroom that Mano had struck. He was in a different wing of the house recovering from a recent stroke. He was shaken by the blast and sustained some minor injuries from falling debris, but he survived. The greatest role of Mano's life had ended in a spectacular failure. He had sacrificed everything for a hit that missed its mark. When the investigators sifted through the wreckage, they found the remains of the camera and the photographer who had been an unwilling participant in Mano's final act. They found the suicide note Mano had left behind, a rambling manifesto that mixed film industry jargon with radical nationalist rhetoric. To the public, it was a bizarre and terrifying footnote in a year already defined by scandal. It was the story of a man who couldn't tell the difference between the movies and reality, a man who thought that a violent ending could somehow provide a meaningful beginning. The image of the kamikaze actor remains a haunting part of Tokyo's history. It serves as a reminder of how easily the shadows of the past can be resurrected by those who feel lost in the present. Mano wanted to be a hero, but he ended up as a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession. He died in a rented plane wearing a costume that didn't fit the era, aiming for a man who wasn't even in the room. The fire at the Kodama mansion eventually went out, but the questions about what drove a young man to fly into the sun stayed in the air for a long time. As the smoke clears from the shattered roof in Tokyo, the sound of the roaring engine is replaced by a much quieter, more rhythmic sound. We travel thousands of miles across the map, leaving the political violence of Japan behind. We arrive at a desolate, beautiful stretch of coastline in South Africa, where the waves of the Atlantic crash against the white dunes of Landudno. Here, the silence isn't caused by a tragedy that has just happened, but by a mystery that has just begun to wash up on the shore, involving a woman who left behind a return ticket she knew she would never use. The morning light on Landudno Beach in December of 1976 was soft and golden, the kind of light that makes the world feel new and untouched. A group of early morning joggers was moving along the high tide line, their feet sinking into the cool, wet sand. As they rounded a curve in the dunes, they saw something that looked out of place among the seashells and driftwood. It was a woman lying perfectly still in the soft sand of a sheltered hollow. At first glance, she looked like she was simply napping after a long walk, enjoying the warmth of the rising sun. She was elegantly dressed, wearing high-end European clothing that suggested she was a person of means. She had on a tailored jacket and a skirt that looked brand new, and her hair was neatly styled as if she had just stepped out of a salon. But as the joggers drew closer, they noticed that her skin was a strange waxen color and there was no movement in her chest. She wasn't napping. She was dead. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on her body, and no footprints leading to the spot other than her own. She looked like she had simply laid down and waited for the end. The local police arrived and began a standard identification process, but they quickly realized that this was going to be anything but standard. When they checked the woman's pockets for a wallet or a passport, they found nothing. They checked her clothing for labels, hoping to trace where the garments had been purchased, but they found that every single tag and label had been meticulously cut out with a sharp blade. Every identifying mark on her person had been removed. The only thing they found in her pocket was a small folded piece of paper, a return train ticket to Johannesburg dated for the following day. The mystery of the Dune woman began to consume the local community. Who was this woman who had arrived at one of the most exclusive beaches in South Africa only to end her life in total anonymity? The police checked hotel registers across Cape Town looking for a guest who hadn't checked out, but no one matched her description. They sent her fingerprints to Interpol, thinking she might be a foreign national, perhaps a traveler from Europe or the Americas. But the databases came back empty. It was as if she had appeared on the beach from another dimension, leaving no trace of her life behind. The unused train ticket was the most haunting detail. It suggested a plan that had been abandoned or perhaps a deliberate attempt to lead investigators in the wrong direction. Did she buy the ticket as a decoy? Or did she truly believe she might go back until the very last moment? For months, the Cape Town authorities kept her body on ice, hoping someone would come forward to claim her. They published her photo in newspapers across the country and even overseas, but no one recognized the elegant woman in the dunes. She had succeeded in becoming a ghost while she was still alive. She was eventually buried in a pauper's grave, marked only by a number and the date she was found. To this day, the case of the Landudno mystery woman remains unsolved. Some believe she was a foreign spy who had been compromised. Others think she was a woman fleeing a tragic secret that she couldn't outrun. She remains a symbol of the ultimate disappearance, a person who took her own identity with her into the sand. The dunes of Llandudno shifted over time, hiding the spot where she was found, but the memory of the woman with the return ticket still haunts the coastline. As the Atlantic wind blows across the silent dunes of South Africa, the landscape shifts once again. We leave the lonely beach behind and travel north, crossing back into the heart of Europe during one of its most turbulent decades. We move from the quiet mystery of a nameless woman to the high-stakes, high-decibel terror of a nation under siege. We are entering the German autumn of 1977, where a powerful man is about to find out that his status and his wealth are no protection against a group of radicals who are determined to bring a government to its knees. At 6 o'clock, on a bright early summer morning in December of 1976, a local resident was taking a quiet stroll along the pristine white sands of Llandudno Beach in Cape Town, South Africa. This particular beach was tucked away in an exclusive high-end enclave where the rugged granite mountains seemed to drop directly into the turquoise waters of the Atlantic. For the people who lived there, it was a sanctuary of absolute peace and predictable beauty. The morning air was crisp and carried the heavy, salty scent of the ocean spray. As the resident rounded a large cluster of boulders near the edge of the dunes, they noticed something unusual. A woman was lying in a small, sheltered hollow of sand. She was positioned on her side, her head resting on her arm as if she had simply decided to take a nap while watching the sunrise. From a distance, there was nothing about the scene that suggested anything other than a peaceful rest. The resident didn't want to disturb her, but as they walked closer, a sense of unease began to settle in their stomach. The woman was dressed far too formally for a morning at the beach. She was wearing an elegant, high-end European-style outfit, including a tailored jacket and a skirt that looked brand new. Even more striking was the fact that she was wearing leather shoes on the sand. As the bystander reached her side, they realized the woman's chest wasn't moving at all. When the local police arrived, they expected to find a clear-cut case of a tragic accident or perhaps a medical emergency. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s with a refined, elegant look that suggested she came from a wealthy background. She looked like she belonged in a high-end hotel or a corporate boardroom, not lying alone in the sand. But as the detectives began their initial walkthrough of the scene, the environment began to feel very wrong. There was no wallet nearby, there was no handbag, no keys, and absolutely no form of identification. The detectives began to check her clothing for any clues about where she might have come from. In the 1970s, clothing labels were the primary way to trace a person's origins. However, as they turned over the collar of her expensive jacket, they found something chilling. The label had been meticulously cut out with a sharp blade, leaving only a few stray threads behind. They checked her skirt, her blouse, and even the lining of her shoes. Every single brand name, size tag, and store label had been removed with surgical precision. It wasn't just that she was missing her ID. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to strip away her entire history. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a calculated effort to ensure that if she were ever found, she would remain a total ghost to anyone who didn't already know her face. The only piece of jewelry she wore was a high-quality Swiss-made watch. It was still ticking, marking the passage of time over a body that had stopped moving hours ago. The detectives noted the time and then checked her pockets one last time. Deep inside her jacket, their fingers brushed against a small folded piece of paper. They carefully extracted it, hoping for a name or an address. Instead, they found a return train ticket to Johannesburg dated for the very next day. This ticket changed the entire nature of the investigation. It suggested that this woman hadn't intended to stay in Cape Town forever. She had a life waiting for her nearly 1,000 miles away in the Golden City of the North. The investigators began to wonder if she had come to the coast for a final, beautiful view before making a tragic choice. An autopsy later confirmed their suspicion she had passed away from a massive overdose of professional-grade sleeping pills. The search for her identity turned into a national obsession. The police contacted every hotel and guest house in the Cape Town area looking for a woman who hadn't checked out or a suitcase left behind in a lonely room. They spent weeks cross-referencing missing persons reports from Johannesburg and beyond. They shared her description with the Swiss watchmakers and European fashion houses, but since all the labels were gone, they were essentially searching for a needle in a haystack. Days turned into months, and the woman remained nameless. No one came forward to claim her. No grieving husband or frantic parent arrived at the station to identify her. It was as if she had meticulously planned her own disappearance from the world, ensuring that her departure would leave no trail for anyone to follow. The mystery of why she had removed the labels from her clothes became the central question. Was she a foreign spy? A woman escaping a dangerous life? Or someone who simply wanted to be forgotten? The investigation eventually reached a complete standstill. Despite her elegant appearance and the high-end items she possessed, there was no record of her existence in any official database. She was eventually buried in a quiet, unmarked pauper's grave in a cemetery overlooking the very ocean she had spent her final moments watching. To the local community, she became known simply as the Dune Woman of Llandudno, a permanent resident of a city she was only supposed to visit. The image of that unused return ticket remains the most haunting detail of the case. It represented a future she had already decided she would never see. The train back to Johannesburg departed on schedule the next day, and somewhere on that manifest was a name that belonged to her, but since she never showed up, that name remained just another line of text on a page. She had successfully turned herself into a riddle that the sands of the Atlantic coast would keep forever. As the quiet mystery of the beach fades into the salt air, we leave the desolate dunes of South Africa behind and travel north across the equator. We move from the silence of a nameless woman to the deafening roar of a political crisis in Western Germany. We are entering the heart of the 1977 German autumn, where a powerful man is about to find himself in a much smaller, much darker space, held captive by a group of radicals who have stopped at nothing to make their point. On a gray, overcast afternoon in September of 1977, 62-year-old Hans Martin Schleyer was sitting in the back of his armored Mercedes-Benz in the city of Cologne. As the head of the West German Employers Association, he was one of the most powerful and influential men in the country's industrial landscape. He was a man used to being in control, a man who moved through the world with a security detail and the weight of a nation's economy on his shoulders. His commute was a routine he had performed hundreds of times. He was surrounded by 2 escort vehicles filled with trained police bodyguards, and his driver was a professional who knew every shortcut in the city. The convoy was moving through a quiet residential street, and Schleyer was likely reviewing documents for his next meeting, feeling the comfort of the heavy, bulletproof glass surrounding him. To him, the armored car was a mobile fortress, a place where the outside world could not reach him. But as the convoy approached a sharp bend in the road, the lead car suddenly slammed on its brakes. A bright blue van had swerved into the middle of the street, blocking the path completely. Before Schleyer's driver could react, a woman pushing a baby stroller stepped out from behind a parked car. It looked like a typical suburban mishap, the kind of thing that happens every day. The driver of the lead escort car instinctively braced for impact, but there was no baby in that stroller. In a matter of seconds, the peaceful street erupted into a war zone. The woman abandoned the stroller, and several masked individuals armed with submachine guns emerged from the blue van and the surrounding doorways. They didn't hesitate. A hail of bullets tore into the escort vehicles, killing all 4 of Schleyer's bodyguards and his driver almost instantly. The precision of the attack was terrifying. Within 90 seconds, the gunman had shattered the glass, dragged Schleyer from his car, and vanished. The most powerful man in German industry had been snatched from the heart of a major city in broad daylight. The kidnappers were members of the Red Army faction, a radical militant group that viewed Schleyer as the face of everything they hated about the capitalist system. As the news of the ambush spread, a massive manhunt was launched. The police cordoned off the city. Checkpoints were established on every highway, and thousands of officers began searching every apartment and warehouse in the region. While the nation was gripped by fear, Hans Schleyer was experiencing a reality that was far more claustrophobic. He was being held in what the militants called a people's prison. It was a tiny soundproofed room hidden inside a standard apartment building. He was kept in a small wooden box for long periods, allowed out only for scripted photographs where he had to hold up signs demanding the release of imprisoned terrorists. His world had shrunk from the boardrooms of Cologne to a dark, windowless cell. The kidnappers began a high-stakes game of psychological warfare with the German government. They sent videos of a haggard, exhausted Schleyer pleading for his life. The police were desperate, and at one point they were actually searching an apartment building only 2 blocks away from where he was being held. They even questioned a tenant who seemed nervous, but without a search warrant for every single unit, they missed him. The tension in the country reached a breaking point known as the German Autumn. The crisis escalated further when a separate group of militants hijacked a Lufthansa flight, Flight 181, to put more pressure on the government. For 5 days, the world watched as the plane was flown from city to city, the passengers held at gunpoint. The West German government faced an impossible choice: negotiate with terrorists and release violent criminals, or hold their ground and risk the lives of the hostages and Hans Schleyer. The atmosphere in the country was thick with dread. The breaking point came in the middle of the night in Mogadishu, Somalia. A specialized German commando unit, GSG-9, stormed the hijacked plane in a daring rescue mission. Within minutes, they had neutralized the hijackers and saved every single passenger. It was a stunning victory for the state, but for Hans Schleyer, it was a death sentence. The news of the successful rescue reached his captors within hours, and the radicals realized their leverage was completely gone. On October 19, 1977, 43 days after he had been snatched from his car, Schleyer's captors made their final move. They drove him across the border into France, to the quiet town of Mulhouse. There they parked a green Audi on a side street and walked away. A few hours later, a tip was called into the police. When the authorities opened the trunk of the car, they found the body of the man who had once been the most powerful industrialist in Europe. The aftermath of the kidnapping changed West Germany forever. Laws were rewritten, security was tightened, and the country underwent a period of deep soul-searching. Earlier details like the nervous tenant or the missed apartment search were re-examined with a sense of bitter regret. Schleyer had been so close to rescue, yet he had remained invisible behind a single brick wall. The People's Prison had done its job too well, keeping it secret just long enough for the tragedy to become inevitable. The final image of the green Audi parked on a quiet French street remains a symbol of that era's darkness. It was a mundane vehicle in a mundane town, hiding a secret that had brought a nation to its knees. The power and influence Schleyer had spent his life building meant nothing in the face of a small dark trunk. It was a reminder that the world can shift in 90 seconds, turning a fortress into a cage and a powerful man into a tragic footnote in a war he never wanted to fight. As the heavy silence of the German autumn settles over the archives of history, we move away from the cold industrial streets of Europe. We travel toward the shimmering, heat-hazed horizons of the Middle East, moving from a businessman in a trunk to a princess in a prison of tradition. We are entering the hidden corridors of the Saudi royal family in 1977. Where a young woman is about to find that her royal blood is no protection against a law that views her heart as a weapon against the state. At 5:30 on a gray, overcast Monday afternoon in September of 1977, a 62-year-old man named Hans Martin Schleyer was sitting in the back of a metallic brown armored Mercedes-Benz. He was gliding through the quiet residential streets of Cologne, Germany, heading home after a long day of work. As the head of the West German Employers Association, Hans was a man who essentially carried the weight of the national economy on his shoulders. He felt completely insulated within the quiet, leather-scented cabin of the heavy car. Behind him, 2 escort vehicles filled with 5 armed police bodyguards followed closely, forming a mobile fortress designed to repel any possible threat. Hans looked out the thick, bulletproof glass at the familiar rows of trees and tidy houses, thinking about the dinner he would soon have with his wife. To him, this daily routine was the very definition of safety and predictable order. The air inside the car was cool, filtered through a state-of-the-art ventilation system that kept the smells and sounds of the city at bay. He had spent his entire morning in high-level meetings, and the gentle swaying of the Mercedes was almost hypnotic. He trusted his driver, a man who knew every curve of these roads. In his mind, the violence of the outside world was something that happened to other people in other countries, far away from the orderly streets of Cologne. The convoy slowed as it approached a sharp 90-degree bend on Vincennes-Stadt Street. Hans noticed a bright blue van idling near the curb, its paint peeling in small flakes. Just ahead of it, a young woman was pushing a baby stroller across the asphalt. It was a perfectly ordinary suburban scene, but something about the woman's pace felt slightly off to the driver of the lead escort car. He tapped the brakes, expecting her to hurry across, but she did not. Instead of rushing, the woman suddenly let go of the stroller and stepped back toward the sidewalk. The stroller, which appeared to be weighted with something heavy, rolled into the middle of the road, forcing the lead car to slam on its brakes to avoid a collision. Hans felt the Mercedes lurch to a halt, the seatbelt tightening across his chest. Before he could even ask what was happening, the blue van's rear doors swung open with a violent metallic crash. Masked individuals armed with submachine guns poured out of the van like dark liquid. The air, which had been so peaceful just seconds ago, was suddenly shattered by the rhythmic, deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Hans watched in a state of paralyzed shock as a hail of bullets tore through the escort vehicles. He saw the glass of the lead car turn into a white web of frost before disintegrating into thousands of tiny shards that glittered in the afternoon light. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a relentless percussive hammer that felt like it was vibrating inside his own skull. He saw his bodyguards and his driver slumped over their movements, stopped by the force of the impact. His own car was bulletproof, but the gunmen did not try to shoot through the armor. Instead, they swarmed the vehicle, using heavy tools to wrench open the doors. Within 90 seconds, Hans was dragged out of his sanctuary and into the van. He felt a rough burlap hood pulled over his head, plunging his world into a suffocating, scratchy darkness. The van sped away, tires screeching as it wove through the streets he had known his entire life. He could feel the cold metal floor of the van beneath his palms, and the smell of oil and old cigarettes filled his lungs. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, and his throat felt as dry as desert sand. He was no longer a powerful man, he was cargo. After what felt like hours of driving in circles, the van finally came to a stop. Hans was led through a series of doorways and up several flights of stairs, the sounds of his own heavy footsteps echoing in a way that suggested a confined space. When the hood was finally removed, he found himself in a tiny, soundproofed room hidden inside a standard middle-class apartment building. It was what his captors called a people's prison, a space meant to strip a man of his soul. The room was barely larger than a walk-in closet with white painted walls that seemed to press in on him from all sides. There was a single mattress on the floor and a small table with a lamp that cast long, distorted shadows. The silence of the apartment was absolute, a heavy, artificial quiet that made the sound of his own breathing feel dangerously loud. He sat on the mattress, his fingers feeling numb and cold, realizing that he was now a ghost in his own city. In the quietest hours of the night, Hans would press his ear against the thin wall of his wooden box, trying to catch the sounds of the world outside. He could sometimes hear the distant hum of traffic or the faint chime of a church bell, reminders that a vibrant, busy city was continuing to exist just a few yards away. These sounds were both a comfort and a cruelty, highlighting the sheer proximity of his rescue and the terrifying effectiveness of his captor's ability to hide him. For the next several weeks, Hans lived in a state of suspended animation. He was often kept in a small wooden box for long stretches of time, a space so narrow he could barely shift his weight or stretch his legs. The wood was rough against his skin, and the lack of light made him lose all track of time. He lived for the moments when the box was opened, even if it was only to be fed a meager meal or to be questioned by the young, intense radicals who held him captive. He was forced to participate in a series of scripted photographs holding up signs that demanded the release of imprisoned Red Army faction leaders. In these pictures, his once sharp suits were wrinkled and stained, and his face was becoming more haggard and gray with each passing day. He looked into the camera lens with a hollow, pleading expression, hoping that his family would see the fear in his eyes and understand that the man they knew was slowly disappearing. There was a haunting irony to his captivity that Hans would only learn much later. During the height of the massive manhunt, the police were actually searching an apartment building only 2 blocks away from his hidden cell. He was so close to rescue that he might have heard the distant muffled sirens of the cars looking for him, yet he remained invisible behind a single layer of brick and mortar. The state was searching the country for him while he sat in a closet. Back in the government offices in Bonn, the atmosphere was one of grim, unyielding determination. The chancellor had made it clear that the state would not be blackmailed even if the price was the life of a man like Schleier. This decision created a cold, bureaucratic silence that echoed all the way to the tiny apartment where Hans was held. He was being sacrificed for a principle, a fact that he began to sense in the way his captors spoke about the government's refusal. As September turned into October, the atmosphere inside the apartment began to shift. The young radicals who had once been disciplined and calm started to show signs of frantic, nervous energy. They were constantly huddled around a small transistor radio listening to updates about a hijacked Lufthansa flight that was being flown across the Middle East. Hans could feel the pressure rising in the small room, a sharp electric sense of danger that made his skin crawl. He watched the faces of his captors through the open door of his box, seeing the dark circles under their eyes and the way they gripped their weapons. They were no longer the confident revolutionaries they had appeared to be at the start. They were becoming desperate, and desperate people are unpredictable. He realized that his fate was no longer tied to his own actions or even to the negotiations of the government. He was a pawn in a game that was spinning out of control. The breaking point arrived in the middle of the night on October 18th. The radio announced that a specialized German commando unit had successfully stormed the hijacked plane in Mogadishu, Somalia, rescuing every single passenger. Hans saw the faces of his captors turn pale and then harden into masks of cold, desperate resolve. The victory for the state was a death sentence for the prisoner. He knew by the way they looked at him that the time for games was over. He was told to get dressed and his hands were bound tightly behind his back with plastic zip ties that bit into his wrists. He was led back down the stairs and into the rear of a vehicle. They drove for hours, crossing the border into France under the cover of a moonless sky. Hans sat in the back of the car, feeling the vibration of the road beneath him, knowing this was likely his final journey. The world outside the window was a blur of dark trees and empty, silent fields. They eventually pulled into the quiet town of Mulhouse and stopped on a side street lined with ordinary parked cars. He was led to the rear of a green Audi, and as the trunk lid was lifted, he felt the cool, damp night air on his face for the very last time. He looked up at the stars, perhaps thinking of his wife or the life he had built before he was forced into the trunk. The sound of the lid slamming shut was the last thing he ever heard, a final, heavy, hollow click. Inside the trunk of the green Audi, the air was stale and smelled of spare rubber and dust. Hans lay there in the dark, his breathing shallow as he listened to the footsteps of his captors walking away. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the silence of the French night. He had reached the end of the line, a journey that had begun in a luxury car and was ending in a metal box. The finality of the situation settled over him like a heavy shroud, a quiet conclusion to a life. 43 days after he had been taken from his armored Mercedes in Cologne, the body of Hans Martin Schleyer was found in that green Audi. The industrialist, who had once controlled the fortunes of millions, had ended his life in the dark, cramped trunk of a mundane car on a quiet French street. The German autumn had come to a tragic, bloody conclusion, leaving a nation to grapple with the realization that even the most powerful men are fragile when the world turns cold. The image of that green Audi sitting undisturbed on a suburban street while a massive international crisis swirled around it remains a chilling symbol of the era. It was a vehicle that looked like every other car in the neighborhood, yet it held a secret that changed German history forever. Hans Schleyer's life was taken in a war of ideologies, leaving behind a haunting legacy of what happens when a human being is reduced to nothing more than a bargaining chip. As the heavy silence of the German autumn settles over the archives of history, we move away from the cold industrial streets of Europe. We travel toward the shimmering, heat-hazed horizons of the Middle East, moving from a businessman in a trunk to a princess in a prison of tradition. We are entering the hidden corridors of the Saudi royal family in 1977, where a young woman is about to find that her royal blood is no protection against a law that views her heart as a weapon against the state. At 10 o'clock on a warm, humid evening in 1977, a 19-year-old girl named Misha'al bint Fad sat on a balcony in Beirut, Lebanon. She was watching the golden lights of the city reflect off the Mediterranean Sea, feeling the soft salt breeze move through her hair. For Misha'al, this city was more than a place of study. It was a sanctuary. Here she was a princess of the House of Saud, but she was also something much more precious. She was free. Back in Riyadh, her life was a series of high walls, silent corridors, and the constant heavy expectation of royal tradition. But in Beirut, the air smelled of old books, coffee, and possibility. She was a student at the university, and for the first time she could walk through the world without a fleet of guardians. It was during these quiet, unsupervised hours that she met a young man named Khaled, the nephew of a diplomat. He was kind, intelligent, and he saw her as a person, not a title. Their relationship was a secret garden they cultivated in the heart of a chaotic city. They met in small cafes tucked away in narrow alleys, speaking in low voices about a future that felt both inevitable and impossible. Khaled didn't treat her with the distant reverence of a subject, and she didn't view him with the cold detachment of a royal. They were simply two young people in love. But as the semester drew to a close, Misha'al felt the walls of her old life beginning to close in again. The first sign that her sanctuary was crumbling came in the form of a brief, formal letter from her family. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. She was being called back to Saudi Arabia, and rumors were already circulating that a marriage had been arranged for her, a union that would serve the interests of the family but would extinguish the light she had found in Beirut. She looked at the letter on her desk, the fine paper feeling like lead in her hands, and she knew that if she went back, she would never see Khaled again. Desperation has a way of making the most dangerous plans seem like the only logical choice. Mishaal and Khalid decided they could not live apart, and they certainly could not live under the thumb of a forced marriage. They hatched a plan that belonged in a high-stakes thriller. To avoid being pursued by the long arm of the Royal Security Forces, Mishaal decided she had to vanish completely. She traveled to a secluded stretch of the Lebanese coast, a place where the cliffs were steep and the water was treacherous. She stood on the edge of a jagged rock, feeling the spray of the Mediterranean on her face, and left her shoes and her favorite shawl behind. She wanted the investigators to find those items and assume she had been swept out to sea by a rogue wave. For several days, the ruse worked perfectly. Divers were sent into the water, and the family went into a period of official mourning. In their minds, the problem of the rebellious princess had been solved by the sea, but Mishaal was already miles away, hiding in a safe house. Khalid had secured forged passports for both of them, documents that identified them as ordinary citizens from a neighboring country. They spent their final night in Beirut in a small, nondescript apartment, barely speaking. The gravity of what they were doing was settling over them like a heavy shroud. They weren't just running away, they were committing high treason against one of the most powerful families on earth. Khalid held her hand, his palms damp with sweat, promising her that once they reached Europe they would be safe. They decided to catch a flight from Jeddah, thinking that the airport there would be so busy that they could slip through unnoticed among the thousands of pilgrims and businessmen. Mishaal underwent a physical transformation, cutting her long dark hair until it was short and ragged. She bound her chest and dressed in a traditional male thobe, covering her head with a red and white checkered shamag. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a princess. She saw a terrified young man with eyes that were much too old for his face. The Jeddah airport in 1977 was a place of intense swirling energy and suffocating heat. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and the sound of 1,000 different languages. Mishaal felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as she stood in the long, slow-moving line at the passport control counter. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the scuffed floor tiles, trying to mimic the confident, casual stride of the men around her. She felt like a fraud in her own skin. Beside her, Khalid was trying to remain calm, but his fingers were twitching rhythmically against his side. The line moved forward one person every 2 minutes. Mishaal could feel the cold sweat soaking into the fabric of her disguise. She tried to steady her breathing, counting the seconds between each step. She told herself that once they were on that plane, the nightmare would be over. They would be just 2 more faces in a distant city, free to love and live on their own terms. But then, she reached the front of the line. She handed her forged papers to the officer behind the glass. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes who had seen thousands of faces that day. He glanced at the passport, then up at Mishaal. He didn't look away. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied her features. Mishaal felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her hands feeling cold and numb. The officer didn't stamp the paper. Instead, he picked up a telephone and spoke a single, quiet sentence. Within seconds, 2 armed guards appeared from a side door. The disguise had failed. Perhaps it was the way she stood, or a subtle detail in her forged documents, or maybe someone in Beirut had talked. Mishaal and Khalid were separated and led away into the depths of the airport. The bustling noise of the terminal faded, replaced by the heavy rhythmic click of the guards' boots on the marble floor. They were taken to a small windowless room where the air was stagnant and smelled of old tobacco. There was no trial in the way the Western world understands it. There were only questions and the cold weight of tradition. Mishaal was brought before her grandfather, Prince Muhammad. He was a man of the old world, a man who believed that the honor of the family was more important than the life of any single individual. He looked at her not with grandfatherly affection, but with the detached gaze of a judge. He told her that her actions had brought shame upon the House of Saud. In his eyes, she hadn't just fallen in love, she had committed a crime against the state. The sentence was decided before she even had a chance to speak in her own defense. On a Tuesday morning in 1977, Mishaal and Khalid were taken to a public square in Jeddah. The sun was high and brutal, casting long, sharp shadows across the white stone. A small crowd had gathered, though the execution of a royal was almost unheard of. Mishaal was forced to her knees. She didn't scream, and she didn't beg. She looked at the horizon, perhaps thinking of the balcony in Beirut and the sound of the waves. Khalid was forced to watch her end before his own life was taken. It was a brutal, visceral act of domestic discipline. The Saudi government intended for the execution to be a private family matter, a secret buried in the desert sands, but they hadn't counted on a British journalist who had been following the story. In 1980, a documentary titled Death of a Princess was broadcast on television, revealing the details of Mishal's life and her tragic end to the entire world. The fallout was catastrophic. It sparked a massive diplomatic rift between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, leading to the expulsion of ambassadors and the freezing of trade deals. The documentary itself, directed by Anthony Thomas, was a feat of investigative bravery that nearly didn't happen. Thomas traveled across the Middle East under a pseudonym, interviewing people who had known Mishal in Beirut and Jeddah. He heard stories of a girl who loved Western music and poetry, a girl who had been deeply unhappy in the gilded cage of the palace. Each interview was a risk conducted in back rooms and shadowed corners. The information he gathered was a mosaic of a life that the Saudi state was trying to erase piece by piece. When the film was finally edited and ready for broadcast, the pressure to stop it was immense. The Saudi government offered millions of dollars to the television network to buy the rights and destroy the master tapes. When that failed, they turned to political threats, hinting at a total breakdown in oil exports that could plunge the Western world into an energy crisis. It was a staggering display of how much power a single story can hold. The film was not just a movie. It was a mirror that a powerful regime did not want the rest of the world to look into. Even within the United States, the broadcast faced hurdles. Mobil Oil took out full-page advertisements in major newspapers urging the public to ignore the documentary and calling it a malicious attack on a friendly nation. But curiosity proved stronger than the influence of oil giants. Millions of people tuned in watching the dramatized version of Mishal's final walk into the square. For those few hours, the world was unified in its horror and fascination. The silent princess had finally found a voice, and it was being heard in every living room across the globe. The aftermath of the broadcast saw Mishal's story become a permanent fixture in the history of human rights. It forced a conversation about the treatment of women in conservative societies and the clash between ancient laws and the universal desire for self-determination. The Saudi government eventually realized that they could not kill a story as easily as they could kill a person. Every time a new generation of activists looks into the case of the missing princess Mishal is brought back to life, her brief period of freedom in Beirut serving as a haunting inspiration. Today, if you visit the city of Jeddah, you will find a modern metropolis that looks toward the future. The square where the execution took place has been transformed part of a city that prizes its place on the global stage. But the ghosts of 1977 still linger in the humid night air. The story of Mishal and Khaled is told in whispers, a cautionary tale for some and a tragedy for others. It remains a stark reminder that the most dangerous thing a person can do is believe that they are free when they are actually just at the end of a very long tether. The legacy of Mishal bint Feud serves as a haunting reminder that even within the most fortified palaces, the human heart remains the most unpredictable element of all. She lived a life of extraordinary privilege, yet she died for the most ordinary of human desires. Her story is a testament to the fact that some fires cannot be extinguished by high walls or silent corridors. The Mediterranean waves she loved so much continue to crash against the rocks in Beirut, carrying the memory of a woman who was briefly, beautifully, and dangerously free. As we leave the shimmering, heat-hazed horizons of the Saudi desert, the sound of the wind shifting over the sand begins to fade. We move away from the heavy weight of tradition and the tragic end of a princess heading back across the Mediterranean toward the historic heart of Italy. We are moving from a story of a heart held captive to a story of a much more professional, almost polite kind of crime. We are arriving in Rome in 1975, where a group of men is about to prove that with the right blueprint, you can peel back the secrets of the world. At 10 o'clock on a bright, bustling morning in October of 1975, a 45-year-old security guard named Lorenzo was sitting in the cramped, windowless cabin of a heavy armored transport truck in the heart of Rome, Italy. Lorenzo was a man who valued silence and protocol above all else. He had spent 15 years working for the security division of the Bank of Italy, and he had learned that in his profession, a boring day was the very best kind of day you could have. The interior of the truck was a masterpiece of cold industrial engineering. It smelled of motor oil, stale espresso from a thermos, and the metallic tang of heavy-duty air filtration. Lorenzo sat on a narrow, uncomfortable bench in the rear compartment, his hand resting habitually on the grip of his service pistol. Across from him sat his partner, a younger man named Marco, who was checking his watch every few minutes. They were surrounded by millions of lyre and banknotes and several crates of gold coins. For Lorenzo, this truck was not just a vehicle, it was a mobile fortress. The steel plating was thick enough to stop a high-velocity rifle round, and the doors were secured with a complex series of deadbolts that could only be opened from the inside using a specific sequence of electronic codes. In the chaotic social climate of 1970s Italy, a period known as the Years of Lead, the streets of Rome could be incredibly dangerous. But inside this metal box, Lorenzo felt completely untouchable. The truck began to lurch forward, navigating the narrow cobblestone streets of the historic center. Lorenzo could feel every bump and dip in the road through the heavy suspension. He closed his eyes and tried to visualize their route, memorizing the turns toward the main bank vault. He knew that outside those steel walls, the city was alive with the sound of Vespas and shouting vendors, but in here, the world was reduced to the rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine and the vibration of the floor. As they approached a particularly narrow stretch near the Piazza Navona, the truck ground to a sudden, unexpected halt. Lorenzo opened his eyes and looked at the small reinforced periscope used to see the street. He saw a commercial delivery van parked haphazardly across the lane, its hazard lights blinking lazily. It looked like a standard Roman traffic jam, the kind of mundane inconvenience that happened a dozen times a day. Lorenzo sighed, settled back into his seat, and waited for the path to clear. Usually, the driver would honk the horn or lean out the window to shout at the obstruction, but today the cabin remained oddly quiet. Lorenzo figured the driver was simply following the new protocol of maintaining a low profile during delays. He looked over at Marco, who was leaning his head against the steel wall, seemingly drifting off to sleep. The minutes began to tick by, and the air inside the rear compartment started to feel unusually warm, as if the autumn sun were beating down. About 5 minutes into the wait, Lorenzo noticed a very faint rhythmic sound. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the clatter of footsteps. It was a high-pitched metallic rasping, almost like the sound of a giant fingernail scratching against a chalkboard. He frowned and tilted his head, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the wall directly behind his head. He reached out and touched the steel plate, expecting it to be cold, but his fingers recoiled instantly. The metal was hot, not just warm from the sun, but radiating a searing, localized heat that made the air shimmer. Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat. He thought perhaps there was an electrical fire in the wiring harness or a mechanical failure in the cooling system. He didn't think of an attack because there had been no explosion, no shouting, and no gunfire. He watched in stunned silence as a tiny, glowing red bead of light appeared on the interior surface of the heavy steel wall. That bead of light began to move, tracing a perfectly straight line toward the ceiling. It was followed by a thin plume of acrid white smoke that smelled like burning ozone and chemicals. Lorenzo realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that someone was using a thermal lance, a tool capable of cutting through reinforced steel like a hot knife through butter. But it wasn't a jagged, violent cut. It was precise, silent, and terrifyingly professional. He reached for his radio to alert the driver, but when he keyed the microphone, all he heard was a wall of static. The thieves had deployed a localized frequency jammer, cutting the fortress off from the rest of the world. Lorenzo felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead, and his fingers began to tremble. He looked at the glowing line on the wall and realized that the thieves weren't trying to blow the doors off. They were doing something far more creative. They were unzipping the truck from the outside while the guards sat inside. As the thermal lance completed its circuit, Lorenzo heard a series of heavy mechanical clicks. It sounded exactly like someone was using a massive industrial version of a kitchen can opener. He watched paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it as a large rectangular section of the truck's side panel began to peel outward. The heavy steel curled back with a groan of protesting metal, revealing the bright, terrifyingly normal Roman sunlight and the masked faces of 4 men standing in the street. The thieves didn't use many words. They didn't need to. They tossed a small canister into the opening, and a thick, sweet-smelling gas filled the compartment. Lorenzo tried to hold his breath, his hand fumbling for the door release, but his limbs felt like they were made of lead. His vision began to blur at the edges, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took him was a pair of gloved hands reaching for the crates of gold coins. It was a heist performed with the grace of a ballet. When Lorenzo woke up an hour later, he was still inside the truck, but the environment had changed completely. The commercial van was gone, the street was once again filled with curious onlookers, and the side of his invincible fortress looked like an empty sardine can. Millions of lire were gone, and the gold coins had vanished without a trace. The police were already on the scene, their faces a mixture of confusion and professional respect for the technical skill displayed by the robbers. The investigation into the sardine can heist, as the newspapers quickly dubbed it, revealed a level of planning that haunted the Bank of Italy for years. The thieves hadn't just gotten lucky. They had obtained a set of stolen blueprints from the factory where the armored trucks were manufactured. They knew exactly where the structural weaknesses were, and they knew how to bypass the vibration sensors that should have triggered a silent alarm the moment the thermal lance touched the hull. The precision of the peeling was so clean that it suggested the use of a modified high-torque mechanical opener, a device the thieves had likely built specifically for this job. They had practiced on scrap metal until they could open a truck in under 4 minutes. It was the most polite and professional heist in Italian history, carried out in broad daylight in one of the most crowded cities on Earth. No shots were fired, and the only physical evidence left behind was a single discarded glove. The mystery of who was behind the job remained unsolved for years, a lingering shadow over the Roman police force. It wasn't until a member of the notorious Magliana gang turned informant in the late 80s that the truth finally came out. He described the sardine job as a masterpiece of criminal engineering, a heist that required more brains than brawn. The gold had been melted down within hours, and the banknotes had been laundered through a series of offshore accounts before the sun had even set. For Lorenzo, the experience changed the way he saw the world. He retired from security work a few months later, unable to sit in a quiet room without checking the walls for heat. He realized that no fortress is truly impenetrable if the person outside has the right tools and enough time. The image of that steel wall curling back like paper remained his final haunting memory of the service, a reminder that in a city like Rome, the most ordinary objects can become weapons in the hands of a genius. As the golden Italian sun sets over the historic ruins of Rome, the sound of the city's chaotic traffic begins to fade into a much more somber domestic silence. We leave the professional precision of the Italian underworld behind and travel across the Atlantic, moving from a daylight heist to a suburban nightmare in North Vancouver. Here the danger isn't found in a thermal lance or a stolen blueprint, but in the final, agonizing block of a young girl's walk home where safety was only a few steps away. At 3 o'clock in the morning on a cool, damp night in July of 1976, an 11-year-old girl named Rona Duncan was walking down a quiet residential street in North Vancouver, Canada. She had just left a high school party with some older friends, and she was in high spirits, her mind filled with the music and laughter of the evening. She was a typical kid, well-liked and full of energy, and she was only a few minutes away from the comfort of her own bed. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people didn't feel the need to lock their doors during the day. It was a safe middle-class community where everyone knew their neighbors, and the streets were lined with towering evergreen trees that smelled of pine and rain. Rona could see the soft yellow glow of the porch lights reflecting off the damp pavement. She was so close to home that she could see the silhouette of her own house standing against the dark mountain-framed horizon. At 3 o'clock on a cool, damp morning in July of 1976, an 11-year-old girl named Rona Duncan was walking down a quiet residential street in North Vancouver, British Columbia. She had just spent the evening at a high school party with her older sister and some friends, and her mind was still buzzing with the music and the laughter of the night. She was a typical kid, energetic and well-liked by everyone who knew her. The neighborhood of North Vancouver was the kind of place where people didn't feel the need to lock their doors during the day. It was a safe, middle-class community nestled at the foot of the mountains where the streets were lined with towering evergreen trees that smelled of pine and fresh rain. Rona could see the soft yellow glow of the porch lights reflecting off the damp pavement. She was only minutes away from the comfort of her own bed. Rona was a girl who lived for her community. She was involved in sports, had a wide circle of friends, and was known for her bright smile. That night at the party, she had been the life of the room, dancing and chatting with her older sister's friends. When the party began to wind down, Rona decided to walk the short distance back to her house. It was a route she had taken hundreds of times, a simple path through streets she had known since she was a toddler. Her older sister and her friends watched her walk away waving as she disappeared around the corner. They weren't worried. It was a short walk, and the neighborhood was as peaceful as a church. Rona felt the cool night air on her face, which felt refreshing after the heat and noise of the party. She hummed a tune to herself, her footsteps rhythmically clicking against the sidewalk as she moved past the darkened windows of her neighbors' homes. As she reached the final turn, Rona could actually see her own front porch. The light was on just as her parents had promised, casting a long, welcoming shadow across the lawn. She was only 1 block away. In her mind, she was already turning the key in the lock, slipping off her shoes and creeping up the stairs to her room. Safety was so close she could touch it. It was that final stretch where the world usually feels the most secure and the most familiar. But as she stepped into the shadow of a large cedar tree midway down the block, she noticed a small change in the environment. A car was idling at the curb, its headlights turned off. The engine was running with a low, rhythmic thrum that sounded out of place in the middle of the night. Rona slowed her pace slightly, her eyes trying to peer through the darkness of the car's interior. She couldn't see a driver, but she felt a strange, cold sensation in her chest. She told herself it was probably just a neighbor coming home late or someone waiting for a friend. This was North Vancouver, after all. Nothing bad ever happened here. She adjusted her jacket and tried to walk past the vehicle with a sense of purpose, her heart beginning to beat a little faster against her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on her own porch light, using it as a beacon to guide her through the darkness. She was only 40 yards away from her front door. Then the sound of the car engine suddenly surged. Rona didn't look back. She began to run, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts that burned in the back of her throat. She could hear the car door open and the sound of heavy footsteps hitting the pavement behind her. Her fingers reached out toward her house, her mind screaming for her to just make it to the light. But she never reached the porch. The darkness of the street seemed to rise up and swallow her whole. The next morning, the sun rose over the mountains, casting a beautiful golden light across the neighborhood. Rona's parents woke up and went to her room to wake her for breakfast, but they found the bed was empty and unslept in. At first, they thought she might have stayed over at a friend's house, but a few quick phone calls revealed that no one had seen her since she left the party. A heavy, suffocating blanket of dread began to settle over the Duncan household. Around 7 o'clock, a neighbor was walking his dog along the very same block where Rona had been walking just hours before. As the dog pulled toward a thick patch of bushes near a vacant lot, the man saw a flash of color that didn't belong there. He moved closer and found Rona's body. She was lying just yards away from her own home, so close that she could have seen her own bedroom window from where she fell. The peace of North Vancouver was shattered in a single instant. The police arrived and immediately cordoned off the area. The investigation was intense from the very start. They interviewed every teenager who had been at the party, every neighbor who might have been awake, and every person who had been seen in the area that night. They were looking for a monster in a safe place. The medical examiner confirmed that Rona had been sexually assaulted and strangled, a crime of sudden visceral violence that left the community paralyzed with fear. One of the few clues they had was the description of that dark, late-model sedan that several witnesses remembered seeing idling on the street around 3 in the morning. They checked thousands of vehicle registrations and interviewed hundreds of drivers, but the car seemed to have vanished into thin air, much like the killer himself. As the weeks turned into months, the leads began to dry up, and the file on Rona Duncan began to grow cold in the detectives' cabinets. The shock of the crime rippled far beyond the borders of the neighborhood. In 1976, children were often allowed to roam freely, and the idea that a young girl could be snatched just steps from her door changed the parenting style of an entire generation in British Columbia. Parents began escorting their children everywhere, and the once vibrant streets of North Vancouver became quiet after dark. The innocence of the 70s was dying, replaced by a new sharp awareness. For decades, Rona's family lived in a state of suspended animation. They never moved from the neighborhood, and they never stopped looking at the faces of the men they passed on the street, wondering if they were walking beside a killer. The porch light was left on every single night, a silent memorial to a girl who had almost made it home. The case became a permanent part of the local lore, a cautionary tale about the 1-block gap between safety and the unknown. The older sister who had been at the party carried a heavy weight of guilt that no amount of time could fully ease. She often sat on that same porch looking out at the cedar tree down the block, replaying those final moments when she watched Rona walk away. She wondered if a single choice, a single minute of difference, could have changed the outcome. The grief was not a static thing. It was a living, breathing part of their daily existence, woven into the fabric of the family. But the detectives at the North Vancouver detachment never truly gave up. In 2013, they decided to apply a new type of forensic science to the biological evidence that had been meticulously preserved since 1976. They were able to extract a full, high-quality DNA profile of the man who had killed Rona. They ran it through every criminal database in Canada and the United States, expecting a hit, but the system returned a devastating silence. This meant that the killer had likely never been arrested for a violent crime in the years following the murder, or he had managed to stay entirely off the grid. However, the science was about to take another massive leap forward. The investigators turned to forensic genealogy, the same technique that had recently been used to catch the Golden State Killer. They began to upload Rona's killer's DNA to public ancestry databases, looking for anyone who shared a genetic link to him. They didn't find the killer's name immediately, but they found his relatives. They found distant cousins, great aunts, and second-tier family members who had unknowingly handed over the key to the mystery by taking a simple heritage test. The detectives began the painstaking process of building a massive family tree, branch by branch, moving closer to the center. They are now looking for a man who would have been in his early 20s in 1976 and lived in North Vancouver. The hunt is more active today than it has been in 40 years. The police have a genetic map of the killer's identity, and they are narrowing the list of suspects down to a handful of names. It is only a matter of time before they knock on a door and find a man who has been hiding his secret for 5 decades. They want to give Rona's family the one thing they have been denied for a lifetime: the truth about what happened in that final block of her walk home. As the investigation moves toward its final conclusion, the people of North Vancouver still feel the weight of that night in 1976. The story of Rona Duncan is a reminder that the world can change in the space of a few yards, and that the monsters we fear don't always come from far away. They can be waiting in the shadows of a familiar cedar tree just out of reach of the light. The porch light remains on a beacon through the decades for a girl who is finally on her way home. We often think of our neighborhoods as fortresses, places where the rules of the world don't apply. We believe that if we can just see our front door, we are safe. But Rona's story teaches us that the transition from the public world to the private sanctuary of home is the most vulnerable moment of all. It is a thin, fragile line that we cross every day without thinking, never realizing how much can happen in the space of a single block when the shadows decide to move. In the silence of the North Vancouver nights, you can almost hear the rhythmic clicking of footsteps on the pavement and the low thrum of an idling engine. The mountains still watch over the valley, and the evergreen trees still smell of rain, but the air feels a little heavier near the spot where Rona fell. The community waits for the final piece of the puzzle to drop into place, for the name of the man in the dark sedan to be spoken out loud so that the shadows can finally be cleared. The detectives keep their files open, their eyes fixed on the genetic branches of a family tree that is slowly revealing its darkest secret. They are driven by the memory of a little girl who was only 40 yards from safety. Every new DNA match brings them closer to the moment of reckoning, a moment that has been 40 years in the making. The science of the 21st century is finally catching up with the crimes of the 20th, proving that time is no longer a shield for those who walk in the dark. The neighbor who found Rona that morning never spoke much about it to the press, but those who knew him said he was never the same. He sold his dog and moved away a year later, unable to walk down that block without seeing the flash of color in the bushes. His experience is a testament to the secondary victims of these crimes, the people whose lives are touched by the darkness and who carry a piece of that tragedy with them forever, long after the yellow police tape has been removed. And so we end our journey through the 12 mysteries of the 1970s. We have traveled from the high-stakes political corridors of Manila to the quiet, sun-bleached dunes of South Africa. We have seen the masks of killers in London and the clever heists of Rome. Each story is a thread in a larger tapestry of a world that was shifting, moving from a time of relative trust into an era where we learned that the person next to us might be hiding a secret that could change everything. Thank you for staying with me through these shadows. If these stories have left you looking a little more closely at the dark corners of your own home, or if you found yourself holding your breath during the final stretch of a walk, then you understand the power of the unknown. Please remember to check your locks one more time, keep your porch lights on, and stay close to the people you love. The world is full of stories that are still waiting to be told, and the truth is often hiding just out of sight. Good night and stay safe. The morning light will be here soon, and with it the safety of the routine. But until then, listen to the silence, and remember that every shadow has a history. We will be back soon with more stories that defy logic and explore the depths of the human experience. Until next time, keep your eyes on the light, and your doors bolted tight. The mysteries of the past are never truly gone. They are just waiting for the right moment to step back into the present. The final image that remains is not the violence but the light. It is the golden domes of a Bulgarian cathedral, the neon signs of Hong Kong, and the humble porch light of a home in North Vancouver. These are the beacons we build against the dark, the small signs of hope that tell us where we belong. Even when the darkness seems overwhelming, these lights continue to burn, waiting for the truth to be found and for the missing to be brought back into the warmth of the known world. When we think about the story of Rona Duncan, we are not just looking at a cold case from 1976. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the way we perceive our own safety. There is something uniquely haunting about the measurement of one single block. In our minds, 40 yards is a distance we cover without thinking a brief transition between the public world and the private sanctuary of our front door. But in this story, that one block is transformed into an insurmountable, infinite distance. It is the one block gap that serves as the heart of the mystery, a space where the rules of a safe, middle-class neighborhood simply ceased to apply. We are haunted by the idea that Rona was close enough to see her own porch light, close enough to imagine the smell of her own hallway, yet she was effectively miles away from help. The porch light itself becomes a silent, cruel character in this narrative. For decades, that light was left on by the Duncan family, acting as a beacon for a girl who was already gone. It represents the hope that refuses to die, but it also highlights the terrifying passivity of our built environment. The light was there, the house was there, and the parents were inside, yet none of those things could reach out into the dark to save her. We find ourselves wondering about the nature of a safe neighborhood. In the 1970s, safety was a communal agreement, a feeling that everyone was looking out for everyone else. When that agreement is broken by a sudden visceral act of violence, the damage is not just to the victim, but to the entire collective psyche. The evergreen trees of North Vancouver, which once felt like a protective wall, suddenly felt like a hiding place. There is a specific kind of horror in the domesticity of the crime. Rona wasn't snatched from a dark alleyway in a dangerous part of the city. She was taken from a sidewalk where her neighbors were sleeping just yards away. This forces us to confront the reality that our homes are not fortresses. They are fragile shells, and the space between the street and the door is a threshold where we are at our most vulnerable, precisely because we feel most secure. The story also forces us to look at the dark sedan as a symbol of the anonymous intruder. In a neighborhood where everyone knows each other's cars, a strange vehicle idling at 3 o'clock in the morning should have been a red flag. But because the environment was so peaceful, the sound of an engine was easily dismissed as a mundane detail. This is where the fear lives, in the moments when our own logic and self-reassurance betray us. We are haunted by the what-ifs that follow the survivors. Rona's older sister carried a burden that is impossible for most of us to fully comprehend. To watch a sibling walk toward home and believe they are safe only to find out they never arrived creates a psychological ghost that never leaves. It is the guilt of the survivor, the feeling that a single minute of difference or a single choice to walk together could have rewritten history. Then there is the neighbor, the man who was just walking his dog on a beautiful golden morning. He represents all of us, the ordinary person who stumbles into the aftermath of a nightmare. The fact that he could never walk down that block again without seeing the flash of color in the bushes tells us that the landscape of a crime scene is permanently altered. To him, the vacant lot wasn't just dirt and weeds. It was a memory of the end of innocence. The investigation itself reveals a systemic flaw in the way we used to pursue justice. In 1976, the police were looking for a monster, someone who looked like a killer. But the reality of forensic genealogy today suggests that the killer was likely someone who appeared perfectly normal. He was a man with a family tree, a man who perhaps lived a quiet, unremarkable life for 40 years while the Duncan family sat on their porch and waited. The transition from microscopic DNA evidence to a full family tree is a modern marvel, but it carries a somber weight. It reminds us that the truth was always there, hidden in the cells of the evidence, waiting for the world to catch up. The science doesn't just find a name. It exposes a life lived in the shadows. It forces us to ask how a person can carry such a heavy secret for 5 decades while the rest of the world moves on. There is a profound silence that follows the solving of a cold case like this one. When the name is finally spoken and the door is finally knocked on, there is no grand sense of triumph. There is only the realization of how much time has been lost. The justice provided by a DNA match is a sterile, quiet thing. It doesn't bring Rona back, and it doesn't remove the 40 years of porch lights that burned for nothing in the North Vancouver night. The haunting quality of the story comes from the realization that the predator didn't have to be a genius to succeed. He only had to be patient. He waited in the one-block gap where he knew the guard would be down. This reveals a chilling truth about the geography of our lives. We spend so much time worrying about the dangers far away that we forget the most dangerous place is the last few steps before we reach the safety of our own locks. We find ourselves thinking about the mountains that watch over Vancouver. They are ancient, indifferent witnesses to everything that happens in the valley below. The evergreen trees still smell of rain and the air still feels crisp, but the map of the neighborhood is now marked with a permanent, invisible scar. Every time a new resident moves into that block, they are stepping into a history they might not know, but one that the soil and the trees remember. Ultimately, what stays with the listener is the image of a girl who almost made it. We don't think about the violence as much as we think about the proximity. We think about the hand reaching for the doorknob, the foot stepping onto the driveway, and the porch light glowing just out of reach. It is the tragedy of the near miss, the story of a return that was interrupted by a shadow that refused to let go until the light was finally extinguished. The final haunting image is the realization that the truth doesn't always set us free. Sometimes it just confirms the depth of the loss. When the killer is finally identified, he will be an old man, perhaps fragile and gray. The monster of 1976 has been replaced by a ghost of the present. This doesn't make the crime any less horrific, but it adds a layer of tragic irony to the decades of waiting that the Duncan family had to endure. We are left with the silence after the justice is served. It is a humane, quiet silence that acknowledges the pain of the past while looking toward a future where such gaps might finally be closed. The story of Rona Duncan is a lesson in the fragility of our daily lives and the enduring power of a family's love. It is a story that asks us to look a little closer at our own neighborhoods and to remember that every porch light has a reason for burning. The one-block gap is no longer just a measurement of distance, it is a measurement of our collective memory. It is a place where we honor the missing and where we remind ourselves that the search for the truth is never truly over, no matter how many decades have passed. As the sun sets over the mountains and the lights begin to flicker on across the valley, we are reminded that safety is a gift and the way home is a path we should never have to walk alone. When the final chapter is written and the name of the man in the dark sedan is entered into the record, the porch light on Lyndhurst Drive can finally be turned off. But the glow of that light will stay with us, a reminder of the girl who was only 40 yards away. It is a story that ends not with a bang, but with the quiet, steady click of a puzzle piece finally falling into place, bringing a long overdue piece to a neighborhood that never forgot. The fear of losing control is at the heart of why this case resonates so deeply. We like to believe that if we follow the rules, if we walk home, stay in our neighborhood, and stay near the lights, nothing bad can happen. Rona followed all the rules. She was a good kid in a good place. The realization that even then the world can turn dark is the fundamental surprise that haunts us. It is the systemic flaw in our belief that we can control our own safety. We are left wondering about the human cost of the silence. For 40 years, the killer lived as a neighbor, a coworker, or a friend to someone. That human flaw, the ability to hide a monster behind a mundane life, is perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. It suggests that the shadows are not just on the street, they are inside the people we pass every day. The resolution of the case brings a name, but it doesn't always bring an explanation for the silence. The conclusion of our journey through these stories is a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the darkness, the search for Rona never stopped. The detectives, the family, and the community kept the light burning through the decades. This persistence is the only true answer to the shadows. It is the proof that while a life can be taken in a single block, the memory of that life can span across generations, eventually leading the way back to the truth.